advised by the Assistant Town Clerk that we have a quorum. Would you take your seats, please? We start the proceedings this evening with Article 19. We have quiet, please. Before we get to Article 19, I have two changes in the electronic vote totals that were announced last night. On Article 11, the final vote is 153 in favor, 40 against, and 11 abstentions. The original count was 151 in favor, but two people's votes were not properly recorded. And on Article 18, the referral vote, the total is 102 in favor instead of 101, 74 against, and 4 abstentions instead of 5. So the record will show those totals. On Article 19, the motion before you is on page 19-18, goes over to 19-22, and it deals with the parking regulations, and the areas in which that are affected are those shown on the map on page 1920. If you'll take a look at that map, there is really no way that someone on the borders of that elliptical configuration could figure out whether or not they were within the area affected by this article. That's a problem, because this is supposed to be noticed to all citizens, and if you can't figure out whether or not you're affected by the article has a defect. This was brought to my attention by a couple of town meeting members, and I had the option of not allowing Article 19 to come before you, but I did not exercise that option, and you will deal with Article 19 with this particular flaw, which I expect will be vetted by the Attorney General. This is a zoning bylaw change, and it has to be approved, but ultimately by the Attorney General. And I expect that in that context we may get some feedback. But we're going ahead with Article 19. The motion is on page 19-18 through 1922. It's moved by Ms. Heller, seconded by Mr. Englander. And Mr. Englander, you have 10 minutes. I'm sorry, before you begin, there's one change in the motion. At the bottom of page 19-18, instead of to see if the town will amend, it should read, voted that the town amend the zoning bylaw, etc. And I think that's it. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Englander.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Scott Englander, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 6. Warrant Article 19 is about protecting some of Brookline's cherished neighborhoods, bringing our zoning code in line with the way people actually live. In a part of town where nearly 80% of the households have one car or less, and also addressing an unintended consequence of the zoning changes from 2000 that created an incentive for developers to build multi-bedroom units, even in places where studios and one-bedrooms are the highest and best use. Right now in Brookline, we require every new or converted unit have at least 2 off-street parking spaces, no matter where in Brookline the context or historical architecture of the neighborhood no matter how small the unit, how negative the impacts on our streetscape and quality of life. This article seeks to lower that requirement in areas of Brookline near the Green Line. Now, I want to be very clear. The article I'm moving tonight is the amended one, supported by the Board of Selectmen and the Advisory Committee. An earlier, more aggressive version of this article was also supported by Brookline PACS, the Planning Board, the Selectmen's Climate Action Committee, and Green Caucus. But what's before you today really reflects a healthy and productive dialogue over many public meetings and hearings. And I'm glad to say that we've reached a point where we can move forward with broad support. So why am I so passionate about this? The parking requirements put in place by town meeting in 2000 have been something of an experiment. Next. The results are now in. They caused a wide range of unintended consequences. Next. First, they distort the housing market to favor multi-bedroom luxury units and have effectively prohibited the development of studio and one-bedroom units in Brookline, units suitable for singles, couples, seniors, and families without children. And everyone likes that in Brookline, we have a diversity of people. We're surrounded by diversity in part because we have a diversity of housing stock. The existing requirements shift our community away from that diversity. Next. The requirements impact the environment, traffic congestion, and result in building designs, next please, and result in building designs that are incompatible with existing neighborhoods. Excessive parking requirements create spatial dilemmas for new projects, typically resolved by granting relief to developers to encroach on open space, decrease setbacks, or increase building height by putting parking on the first floor. Poorly designed and out-of-scale buildings, next, less open space, and a degraded neighborhood streetscape with increased traffic congestion are some of these effects. Next. More pavement and fewer trees mean increased polluted stormwater runoff and reduced groundwater recharge. Let's have a look at some examples. Next. First, Naples Road. The house on the left is an older home, and one built to conform with the parking requirements is on the right. No one imagined the appearance of these snout houses when they changed the parking requirements in 2000. But so since then, the zoning bylaw had to be changed to limit garage to 40% of the length of the facade. Next. Despite that change, instead of stately homes with ample porches where people interact with their neighbors, we still get this, also on Naples Road. Next. Or this on Center Street, also dominated by the garage on the first floor. Next. Or this on Green Street with underground parking. The attractive Victorian that was there before was welcoming to the street and the sidewalk. But what's there now kind of reminds me of one of those antlion death traps where you might get sucked down into it if you hang around on the sidewalk. On the left, you can see what's across the street, at least for now. So if Brookline had been built with today's parking requirements, it would look and feel nothing like the town we love and would have few of its charms. So this is about protecting the unique and beautiful community fabric. Brookline's minimum parking requirements, like those in other communities, have no scientific basis, but were first put in place because it was thought they would get cars off the streets. Ironically, they've had the opposite effect. Indeed, off-street parking requirements are like a fertility drug for cars. Let's look at the actual patterns of car ownership, parking, and use in Brookline, focusing on the proposed overlay. Next. So you can see here, Coolidge Corner, Brookline Village, Beacon Street and the Sea Line, Route 9, here's the reservoir. This shaded area above this line is the overlay district. And you can find out whether you're inside or out of it on the town's GIS system. The warrant article seeks not to eliminate residential parking requirements, but rather to tailor them to better suit specific contexts. And these are minimums, so they don't prohibit the creation of additional spaces above these levels. The reduced requirements would apply only within the overlay district created for this purpose, which includes all parcels within a half mile of a Green Line station. So why half mile from a T station? Well, that turns out to be a good proxy for the part of Brookline that's more walkable and where car use is lower, and the use of other options is a lot more common. Next. First, car ownership. Federal census data from 2014 show that, on average, households in neighborhoods with the overlay district are car light. Almost 80% have no more than one car, and over 1/4 of households are car free. Next. And if you look at the travel habits of residents in those same neighborhoods, you can see that they're much less car reliant than those in South Brookline, where distances are greater and there are a lot fewer options. So residents in over half of the households in the overlay district on the left take transit or walk, and that's increasing. Compare that to the rest of Brookline on the right, where the Pac-Man-like shape there that's about to gobble up everything else represents the residents in 70% of households that drive alone to work. Various data sources corroborate that parking Brookline residents currently need is much less than what's available to them on site, and the current requirements for new construction. In 2012, the Moderators Committee on Parking, chaired by Lee Selwyn, did a lot of great work on this topic, which included a thorough survey of car ownership and parking. Half of all households in Brookline responded. The survey measured car ownership by neighborhood and unit size, shown here for the overlay district. Next. For 2 bedrooms, for example, you can see that the average was 1 car per unit. You can see that the number of cars owned increases with the size of the unit, number of bedrooms, but that for any size unit, especially the smaller ones, actual car ownership in this part of Brookline is well below the requirement of 2 to 2.3 spaces per unit. Next. One reason the number of cars in Brookline is falling, despite an increase in the number of households, is the recent explosion of options that we have to make it easy to get to work or study, shop, eat, or get around town while owning one less car, or maybe none at all, especially for the younger crowd. And these are all services in use here today, but many weren't in 2000 when the requirements were developed. Next, please. No changes are proposed outside the zoning overlay district. Inside, the amended proposal requires 1 space per studio, 1.4 per 1-bedroom units, and 2 spaces for larger units. Next. Comparing the requirements the amended article proposes in tan to the Moderators Committee survey numbers of cars owned per household in the district in blue, and the current requirements in gray, you can see that while below the current requirements, the proposed ones in the amendment are still far below the average need. Next. Now, some critics have said that the average need doesn't reflect the worst case, which should still be provided for. Note that in any multi-unit building, there's a diversity of needs. But moreover, and I can't emphasize this enough, the proposed requirements are still minimums. They don't prohibit additional parking spaces when they might fit the context of the neighborhood or expected demand of future residents. Next. Now, while the amended article doesn't go as far as I'd hoped, it's a compromise with broad support and moves us in the right direction to address many of the issues I've just highlighted. So I urge you to join the Board of Selectmen and the Advisory Committee and others by voting favorable action on Article 19 as amended. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Davis? What's that? Well, I assume it is.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Jonathan Davis, town meeting member from Precinct 10. Just my stopwatch going here. Clock. Oh, come on. Well, technology, huh? All right. Very strange. All right, Mr. Moderator, could you let me know when I have 3 minutes left, please?
When what?
Could you let me know when I have 3 minutes left? Sure. Thank you. Okay. Please turn with me to page 1922 of the combined reports. This is a Selectman's amendment. The original Article 19 and the amendment repeatedly miss the obvious. If they miss the obvious, they will also miss the nuances, and there will be unanticipated consequences. Let's read together item I on page 1922. Residential uses on any lot for which any portion of the lot is within the Transit Parking Overlay District. Residential uses on any lot for which any portion of the lot is within the Transit Parking Overlay District must provide no fewer off-street parking spaces per dwelling unit than 1 for studio units, 1.4 for 1 bedroom, 2 for 2 bedroom, 2 for 3 or more bedrooms. Our existing residential parking requirements, the requirements we currently have, begin at 2 spaces and go up to 2.3. None of the existing parking requirements is fewer than any parking requirement in the amendment. 2 is not fewer than 1, 2 is not fewer than 1.4, 2 is not fewer than 2, and so on. In other words, the amendment makes no change to existing parking requirements, and it has no practical effect. The amendment does not revoke the existing parking requirements. First of all, it doesn't say that it revokes it. Also, in Massachusetts, there is a legal doctrine of implied repeal, but the state Supreme Court has ruled many times that implied repeal requires that statutes be so mutually inconsistent that they cannot coexist. That's not the case here, where the amendment, if it passes and the existing parking requirements, would be completely compatible with each other. There is no repeal of the existing parking requirements. This is the most obvious example of how the amendment and the original Article 19 miss the obvious. And if they miss the obvious here, what else will they miss? It's like a new car that's built with square wheels. It makes you suspicious about what you'll find or not find under the hood. Can I have the second slide, please? Here's a list of some of the obvious things that are overlooked, and I'm just going to mention a few of these. Note that the amendment only deals with parking for market rate residential. Greatly reducing market rate residential parking requirements lowers developers' costs. When costs are reduced, developers' profits are increased, and increased profits will incentivize developers to make more market rate housing. It's market rate. The amendment concedes that new market rate residential units will cause more cars to be brought into Brookline. There is no legal limit on the size of a studio or a bedroom. Developers can build supersized studios with extra bathrooms, large enough to house expanding families. This is not a new idea. The selectmen were warned about this in the November 2011 combined reports in connection with Hancock Village. Supersized studio condominium units can be built with an extra bathroom, and the buyers of the condo can put in their own interior walls, creating additional bedrooms for expanding families. More North Brookline residents means an increase in the North Brookline school-age population, and we know where that leads. The CND lines are already dysfunctional, especially at commuting times. It's fantasy to think that adding ridership will improve service. The amendment will incentivize the replacement of 1- and 2-family houses in the Brookline M districts. These properties provide welcome and often extensive green space, but they will be replaced with much larger multifamily buildings. Next slide, please. The amendment will hollow out the North Brookline general business and local shopping districts. Developers can game the much lower residential parking requirements against the higher parking requirements for retail and other commercial uses. Also, the amendment overlooks that existing current zoning rules already permit developers to replace 40% of ground floor retail with residential. The effect will be felt especially in the case of existing one-story retail buildings where developers will try to swap ground floor retail space for supersized studios, and where, if other parts of the zoning bylaw permit them, developers will put in at least a second floor of supersized studios. Here's an example: a 2,800 square foot, one-story retail building in a G district with an FAR of 1.5. The zoning bylaw requires 8 spaces. A developer decides to tear it down. He keeps 60% retail ground floor because he's required to. That's 5 parking spaces. He puts in 40% ground floor supersized studio with an extra bath. 1 parking space. He puts in a second floor of 2 supersized studios with extra baths, 2 parking spaces. The result, 8 parking spaces under the amendment, the same as for a 2,800 square foot 1-story building of all retail. In the process, the developer has put the existing store owner out of business in order to do the construction. The new store, when built, will be 40% smaller, less attractive for shopping, and probably less profitable for the new store owner, whoever he or she is. Next slide, please. This shows the results under the amendment with a 2,800 square foot 1-story retail building in an L district with an FAR of less than 1.5. Here, our 2,800 square foot 1-story retail building requires 14 parking spaces. The developer can do the same thing as in the previous slide, and he only needs 11 parking spaces instead of 14. In both cases, if the developer has trouble putting in the new parking, for example, he wants to put in 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom units, he can ask the zoning board to waive up to 50% of the parking. The viability of our commercial districts should be a priority. A disproportionately large share of tax revenues is paid by commercial properties. All of Brookline is more livable and enjoyable with thriving commercial districts rather than struggling in gap-toothed ones. The explanations in the combined reports overlook the effects on the North Brookline G and L districts. Why has there been no study to identify what commercial buildings in North Brookline are at risk? I hope you're starting to see what I mean when I say that the amendment misses things. Okay, can we go to the slash screen, please? Let's talk about 40B. Brookline may avoid 40B if 10% of the housing stock using the latest census data, at present the 2010 census, is what the state considers affordable. But it is not certain that Brookline will actually meet the 10% goal based on the 2010 census. For example, it's possible for buildings to at first be counted towards the 10% but then to fall off the list. If Brookline does not meet the 10% goal based on the 2010 census data, we would have to meet a slide that I'd love to show you. Why don't we try that? Well, I'm going to run out of time. In conclusion, I urge you to vote no action on any floor amendment that would try to put round wheels on this defective vehicle. I urge you to vote no action on the Selectmen's amendment, and if it somehow comes up, no action on the original Article 19. Original Article 19. There are too many obvious problems that have been overlooked, and there will be additional unanticipated problems. To paraphrase Ralph Nader, this vehicle is unsafe for all of Brookline at any speed.
I can assure you, Mr. Davis, that there'll be no amendments from the floor. Ms. Heller?
Nancy Heller for the Board of Selectmen. Article 19, what Jonathan Davis just gave us a lot to think about. Some of those issues we had not considered at all, but I'm going to go ahead with what I have to say, and you'll make up your minds at the end about how you feel about this stuff. But Article 19 in its original form is a citizen petition to decrease by a substantial amount the off-street parking requirements of current zoning adopted in 2000. The proposed new zoning would apply a 1/2 mile radius at any MBTA Green Line stop, and would apply whenever new residential housing units are created in that transit parking overlay district, whether such units are created by new construction or by renovations of an existing building, and that is an important point. Parking requirements have a long history in Brookline as we strive to match off-street residential parking with need, and our efforts date back, can you believe it, as far as 1922. For this evening's purposes, please refer to the chart of parking size per unit on page 1 of the blue supplement number 1, the Advisory Committee's supplemental report. That chart compares 4 options. Our current bylaw, from 2000, the 2013 failed effort to amend that current bylaw, that was the one commonly referred to with the Moderators Committee, the petitioner's original proposal within the Transit Overlay District, and the amendment now supported by the Board of Selectmen, the Advisory Committee, and the petitioner. Essentially, The amended version that you have before you tonight is somewhat smaller than the rates that the Moderators Committee proposed in 2013. The Moderators Committee spent 3 years, reviewed much data, discussed the issues in many, many meetings. Ultimately, that committee crafted its recommendations, which are similar to the ones before you today. There are 3 differences. Number 1, 1.4 parking spaces rather than 1.5 for one-bedroom units. The rationale being that a 0.5 parking space would be required to be rounded up by the zoning law. In other words, if there were only one studio apartment in the, one-bedroom apartment in the building, they would still have to have 2 parking spaces. Number 2, 2 parking spaces rather than 2.3 parking spaces for 3-bedroom units. Again, there's a rationale. It's unlikely that a family in a 3-bedroom unit would have more than 2 cars. Number 3 is the application of the reduced rates only within the transit parking overlay district rather than town-wide, as the 2013 proposal would have done. Compared to our current requirements, tonight's proposal represents a very cautious approach, a balance between those who advocate more significant reductions because access to MBTA theoretically should reduce the need for automobiles, and those who advocate for the status quo because of the increase of market rate units, essentially what Jonathan was talking about, which could undercut the town's efforts to reach safe harbor provisions under 40B. There are many other pros and cons, which you will hear about from other speakers, but I'm going to focus on these 2. Controlling automobile emissions is a very important step in addressing the devastating impacts of climate change. But changing our parking requirements will not have much of an effect on this, if any, because the number of reduction in gas-powered vehicles subject to the article is so few. Electric vehicles, on the other hand, are becoming more and more popular and prevalent, and as technology and government incentives make them more widely available and popular, we should see a demonstrable lessening in the amount of deleterious emissions. And I hope that's true. If there is widespread conversion to electric vehicles, those will not pollute from fossil fuels, but they will require a parking space and an electric charger, which we voted to consider more fully at our next town meeting. One argument against changing our parking requirement is that it will encourage an increase in the number of market rate housing units. Again, what Jonathan Davis was talking about. As most of us are painfully aware, Brookline, especially the area around Coolidge Corner, is currently besieged with applications for 40B development, several of which tower over other buildings in the neighborhood, destroy historic structures in their wake, cut down on open space, and create greater density, which those of us who live in the area don't want. As a town, we cannot emerge from the shadow of 40B residential buildings whose developers can ignore our zoning requirements unless 10% of our housing units are listed on the state's SHI, or Subsidized Housing Index. We are not there yet. And even with our inclusionary zoning law, we have not reached our goal. It's very possible that relaxing parking requirements could result in more market rate units and push our goal further beyond our grasp. We must be vigilant that that doesn't happen. One way to accomplish this is to make sure that our inclusionary zoning bylaw is as effective as it can be. It's difficult to predict, but I believe that it is prudent of us to be cautious in how we make zoning changes so that we don't incur unintended consequences which we do not desire. The Board of Selectmen adopted a cautious approach, as did the Advisory Committee, by proposing the reductions in parking requirements that you have before you. Climate Action Committee considered the original article with more significant reductions in parking and voted to support it. As a member and co-chair of that group, I did not vote with the majority for the reasons that I've discussed earlier, and the full Board of Selectmen did not support the more dramatic decreases in parking in the original article. The vote for favorable action on the amended proposal by the Board of Selectmen is found on pages 19-8, at the bottom of page 19-18 and 19-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spiegel. Your name Spiegel?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Stanley Spiegel, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 2, and here we go. Let me begin with a brief history lesson for those of you who may not have been here in 2000. The reason that the zoning requirement for cars was increased was because we were experiencing a serious parking shortage. The lots were full, the municipal lots were full to capacity, and private spaces were renting at enormous high rents. And it was felt that newcomers who were coming into the high-end housing, which was being built then and is still being built, affluent newcomers willing to spend $1 million, $2 million for a condo, or $4,000 for a rental or more, were bringing cars with them more than the requirements at that time would allow or was required, which was 1.5 per unit. 1.5 is more than the reductions that are now being sought, I point out. So therefore, what's relevant is not the various data based on town-wide averages that the petitioner alluded to, and that's in your book. What we really need to know is whether the new requirements on the new housing, which is being populated by some very affluent people, does that result in an excess or does it not? We need to know how many cars new couples or individuals are bringing with them when they move into the new housing. That's 4% of the town total only at this point. So therefore, a town-wide average doesn't tell you what you need to know, and that's all the data we have. A town-wide average, or no data actually we have, says that there are large numbers of unused and surplus spaces. That was alluded to by a previous speaker. We haven't heard developers or property owners come and say, hey, you made me build 40 spaces, I'm only renting out 21 of them. We haven't heard anything like that, and I'm sure we would if there were large numbers of unused spaces. So as you see, we don't know the number of new cars, and we don't know how many are unused or surplus, and I have to stress this, town-wide averages where 95% of housing has about 1 space or 0. That's an enormous number, enormous amount of housing for which the owners can't possibly, or the occupants can't possibly have more than 1 space. That totally dominates the average. What we need is specific information. Well, let's look at some of the things that we've been told, though, in defense or in support of the article. Next slide, please. We've been told that actually there's been a diminution in the number of cars, and here I have the last 10 years of excise data from the town assessor. The number is fairly constant. It's going up, down a little bit during the recession. It came back up a little bit. Now it may have leveled off somewhat. No big trend there. Let's get please to the next slide. And this is an important slide because it alludes to a main point made by the petitioner a few moments ago. This myth, I will say, that because of the increase in parking requirements, there's been a distortion in the housing market. The facts say something quite different, and it's always good to look at facts. Arm waving may be good for aerobics, but looking at facts is a better bet when you're trying to figure out town policy. In the decade prior to the 1990s, 10% of all units developed were small, studios or 1-bedrooms. In the decade following, that number increased to 16%. Not fewer studios and 1-bedrooms, but more. The larger units dropped correspondingly from 90 to 84%. But one thing that I left off that chart for whatever reason, stupidity, if you look at the 3-bedroom units, and I have that data as well, 3+, that dropped from 37% in the 1990s to 20% after the change. So this notion that because of the increased parking requirements, we have very few studios and 1-bedrooms, but a lot of big units, exactly the opposite. Couldn't be more opposite than the data shows. And as I said, it's always good to look at the data. And that's what the data shows directly from the assessor's database. Believe me, check it out yourself. Next slide, please. We've heard also that it's unfair for people who don't need parking to have to pay for parking. I point out, as I alluded to earlier, we have a huge stock of units with either little or no parking, and many of them have been very nicely renovated, big rooms, nice old buildings, but solid buildings for people who want no or very little parking. 35%, more than a third of the buildings were built before there were any requirements at all, and another 60%, the minimum requirement was only 1 or in some cases 1.2. That adds up to 95% of the total. We don't need to add to that inventory. We have plenty of units available which have no or very little parking. Let's go to the next slide, please. It says parking lack won't deter cars. Why do I say that? Because it didn't in the 1990s. What happened, as I said before, town lots were filled to capacity with long waiting lists for overnight spaces, and privately owned parking spaces were going at a premium, were in high demand. Many people simply parked on the streets in those days because, this may be a secret, but it's an open one, the police don't come by every street every night. They can't. We don't have enough police to do that. And if you get 1 or maybe 2 tickets a week, you're paying about the same rate as if you rented a space which could be 2 or 3 blocks from your home. So people were parking on the streets in front of their homes and paying the ticket. If it cost a little bit more, well, they were paying for the convenience of not having to walk several blocks to rent a space. More importantly, pressure was growing in those days to end the overnight parking ban. And let me tell you, there's already a motion, I understand, a movement to do that. If that ever happens, that will open the floodgates. Then there will be no limit to the number of people who bring cars in and park for free on the street, or even if they have to pay, there'll be practically limitless parking. Let's go to the next one. It's also been said that millennials don't drive anymore. There was an article in yesterday's Globe. Ride-sharing millennials crave car ownership after all. This is from Bloomberg News. The source, some place that does surveys like this, produced this, and it was picked up in the Globe. A little over a year ago, the LA Times had a similar article. Millennials want to drive. They outpace Generation X in new car buying. Again, the reference is there. You can check it out. I can't vouch for the validity of those surveys. I really can't. But I don't think the folks who are telling us, or may be telling us, that their friends who are millennials don't drive, I don't know how accurate that is either. Certainly, the Boston Globe and the LA Times, which are both responsible and reputable newspapers, have published articles claiming that the notion that millennials don't drive is a myth. The half-mile circles, next slide please, the half-mile circles around T-stops, that is a misuse of what these so-called catchment circles, that's a term for them, are intended for. They're meant to predict T ridership. The transit people use that to determine where should they put a stop so that they know they have a good ridership.
You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. That does not tell anything about the number of parking spaces that people have. In fact, Lee Sullivan's committee found that there was no statistically valid relationship between proximity to the T and car ownership. That's because cars are for much more than commuting. If you get to the next slide, they're used for countless other purposes. We all know that. And the green line is only helpful if it takes you where you want to go. And it doesn't take everybody where they go for where they want to go for what they need to do in life. For many residents, cars are an integral part of everyday living. If we go to the next slide, it says cars versus people is meaningless. Who do you think uses cars? It's not chimpanzees. It's people. People use cars to carry out their daily life. They prefer the freedom, convenience, and savings in time that cars provide. Next slide. Do we want to really reduce below 2,000 levels, which we know were problematic and led to parking shortages? I don't see why.
1 minute.
So if we then move to the next penultimate slide, if you will, here's why we should vote no action. It's too risky to drop parking below the 2,000 levels. Lowering for 3 bedrooms is especially risky, and that's part of what we would be voting. More residential development will add school children and already overburden transit. And we have seen that developers will not provide enough parking on their own. That's why there was that problem. Minimum is not enough. You have to force developers to provide what the town needs, and we have an obligation to force that if we're going to retain an overnight parking ban. People have to put their cars somewhere. Final slide. We have seen that the development of smaller units has not been reduced. We see that we have more than enough units to satisfy people who don't need any parking. 95% of the housing stock satisfies that criteria. Setting parking requirements by distance from the T makes no sense whatsoever. It just doesn't fly. There's no correlation. And a final thought, and that is that car owners are not deplorable. And there is somewhat of that in the air. They're our friends, our neighbors, our constituents. Car owners are not deplorable, and people who manage to get by
Please conclude.
without cars do not have a lock on virtue either. Car owners are people like the rest of us, and we have to take care of their needs. Thank you very much.
Ms. Hamlin and Ms. Roberts, would you come forward, please, and sit in the front row center? When I call the next speaker forward, please sit in the center front row.
My name is Linda Hamlin. I'm speaking for the Planning Board. So far, this town meeting has been very supportive of a very progressive agenda, from environmentally sensitive packaging to support of electric cars to the creation of a new district that proactively plans for the future. Town meeting is on a roll. Article 19 is part and parcel of this SMART agenda. Article 19 is well-researched, well-reasoned, and is good planning. The Planning Board and the Zoning Board of Appeals are on the front line of parking issues for the town. Every week, we wrestle with the impact of our parking requirements and what the impact on our neighborhoods are. Our agendas are full of parking and traffic concerns. Developers and owners try to squeeze more in. Abutters and neighbors fight for green space. They fight for privacy, a fence to shut out the view. This is especially critical in North Brookline, where development is rife. Increased parking requirements have not stopped development. Rather, they have led to more expensive projects, limiting the supply of affordable, smaller unit types. We now face ungainly structures where cars take priority over landscape. Roof decks may meet some of the requirements for open space, but they are an unsatisfactory substitute for green and leafy space. Article 19 only sets minimal requirements and does not limit what an owner or developer may want to put in. That is, if other zoning limits are met. And I think that's important to address as well. We have other limits to development besides parking. It is a positive, this article is a positive step to control the traffic that is choking us, the asphalt that is being laid in at an alarming rate. It is only a step. Brookline's location makes us rich. We are what people want, the suburb in the city. Let's use our public transportation advantage to make us better. I think I say this every time I appear in front of the town meeting when parking rules are discussed. Let's consider setting maximum parking requirements. It could just be the next step we need. Therefore, the Planning Board unanimously recommends favorable action on Article 19 as amended.
Thank you. Ms. Roberts, and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Susan Roberts. I live at 69 Green Street in Coolidge Corner. I'm a member of Precinct 2. I'm a real estate attorney. I practice in the Boston area. I do zoning and permitting. I've appeared before many planning boards and boards of appeal throughout Massachusetts and New Hampshire. I know about zoning bylaws. I know about the goals that zoning bylaws and ordinances attempt to achieve, and I know about the tools that are used in the bylaws to help limit development as well. I'm asking that this town meeting vote no on Article 19 because it allows for the reduction in parking requirements without a corresponding change in the zoning bylaw to counterbalance the inevitable increase in density of residential units that would result. I wholly concur with what Mr. Davis said. I thought he made an excellent presentation. And it is in common knowledge, of course, that parking requirements drive the size of a project because constructing parking, particularly underground parking, is expensive. However, in addition to the obvious purpose of parking requirements to provide parking that will take parked cars off of our streets, our parking requirements for many projects also have functioned as a tool to keep the size of projects in check. If we reduce parking requirements, it is intuitive that larger projects with more units will result. Money that is not spent to construct parking will be used to construct additional residential units. A case in point is the recently filed 40B petition, again, another one on Babcock Street. This currently is where a home, a wood frame house is, and the developer is proposing 62 units of housing there with 31 parking spaces, just as in accordance with Mr. Englander's first warrant article as it was initially presented. Coolidge Corner currently has at least 60 40B proposals that would allow over 320 units that are not in Coolidge Corner right now to be built if approved as proposed. These are all within just a few blocks of my house. I understand as well that there are additional at least 3 projects right in the Coolidge Corner neighborhood as well, in the Holiday Inn area, Waldo Durgan Garage,
30
and
seconds.
others, where there's also going to be additional 40B proposals or other development proposals. I'm certainly sensitive to smart growth principles, and I understand the importance of encouraging fewer cars on a road, but if we are going to change the parking requirements, I would respectfully suggest that this amendment is not ready for prime time. We are not ready to make this change until we look at residential density in this area. And if we're going to do one thing on parking, then we need to address density issues and employ other tools to keep Coolidge Corner the same as it is characteristically now, instead of having it be inundated with apartment buildings and high-rises, which is currently what we're beginning to see.
Please
and have
conclude.
seen. Therefore, please vote no on Article 19 as it has been amended. We should not allow for reductions
Yeah,
in
please conclude, ma'am.
parking
Thank you.
requirements. Thank you.
Ms. Hyatt? And Ms. Connors, would you come forward, please?
Angela Hyatt, speaking for a majority of the advisory committee. It's pretty safe to say at this point you have a visceral reaction to the term parking ratios. I was worried that people's eyes would glaze over, but pretty safe to say that's not going to be the case tonight. Regardless, it will be helpful to keep a few things in mind about Article 19 as it's as proposed. Remember, it would apply only to housing within the half mile of the Green Line stops. It reduces the minimum parking ratios. The current ratios were adopted 16 years ago and apply townwide, regardless of their location or proximity to a public transportation stop. And lastly, fewer parking spaces does not automatically mean more residential units, because housing units cannot be built in the same way that parking spaces can be. A majority of the advisory committee expressed concern about Article 19 as originally proposed by the petitioner. Some wanted to see data on car ownership among residents in the new housing developments. Others noted that the Moderators Committee on Parking, which was the group responsible for collecting significant parking data between 2011 and 2013, that they had found no significant correlation between distance from T-stops and car ownerships. Although the advisory committee generally agrees that the parking ratios that have been in place over the last almost 2 decades are ripe for re-examination, there is also concern that drastic reductions could create unintended consequences, such as putting undue pressure on the overnight parking ban, which most feel is critical to keep our town's streetscapes safe. The amendment to Article 19 that is supported by the Advisory Committee, Selectmen, and now the petitioner, recognizes the need to adjust the minimum parking ratios to better reflect the residents' needs and aspirations, but scales these reductions back to align more closely with those proposed by the Moderators Committee on Parking. It's important to remember that Article 19 is about parking minimums, not maximums. Developers can build more parking if they believe the market will bear it, and homeowners can certainly build it if they need it. It is the Advisory Committee's considered view, therefore, that parking requirements in this catchment area should be reduced, but that the town should proceed with caution. The amendment supported by both the Advisory Committee and the Selectmen represents an incremental yet significant reduction in parking requirements based on the significant amount of data that was collected by the Moderators Committee on Parking. Therefore, by a vote of 16 in favor and 6 opposed, the Advisory Committee recommends favorable action on the amended version of Article 19.
Thank you, Ms. Connors.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Patricia Connors, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 3, and formerly Town Meeting Member from Precinct 2. In 2000, North Brookline was awash in development. On any given day, tear-downs, oftentimes of lovely homes with wonderful architectural features, and the construction of fully built-out box housing developments occurred simultaneously on multiple blocks of North Brookline neighborhoods, such that the housing density of these neighborhoods paralleled or exceeded that of Somerville. An intrepid group of town meeting member women, including the deceased Myra Trachtenberg of Precinct 3, decided enough is enough and successfully won the necessary 2/3 vote of town meeting to increase parking requirements, to slow down this development frenzy. And due to reduce profitability for developers, it worked. Ever since then, developers and their entourages of lawyers and consultants have fought to reduce these parking requirements. These folks are likely only too happy to have my esteemed environmentalist colleagues indirectly work on their behalf. If you give the developers this downzoning, they and their eager contractors will come, bringing more residents, more noise, more traffic, more crowded schools, and I dare say more cars, with really no benefit for the neighborhoods affected. To those of you who earn your living from development, I encourage you to consider abstaining from this vote. To everybody else, I urge you to vote no on the amended motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dempsey. And Mr. Ross, would you come forward, please? We're going to hear from Mr. Dempsey.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Chris Dempsey, a town meeting member in Precinct 6, and a member of the Transportation Board, which supports the compromise language you have before you. This neighborhood that you see behind me is my neighborhood. That's Brookline Village in 1908. Next slide. 2 years later, the building that I live in was built in 1910. That's it. It's not the prettiest building in Brookline Village. It's not the ugliest one either, but it's home. Now, what does this building have to do with Article 19? Next slide. Let's start with the numbers. $16,000 annual tax revenue to the town, 0 Brookline Public School students. It's 4 units, 6 residents live there. Our existing zoning would require that those 6 residents have 8 parking spots. But today there's 0. Let's dig in a little bit more. Next slide. What would be required to make my building, 274 Washington Street, compliant with the current zoning code as it exists today? Next slide. Well, there's the parcel. There's no easement in the back and no alleyway. Next slide. So let's go back to the front. How are we going to make this fit 8 parking spots? Next slide. Well, first, we're going to need to eliminate 3 on-street parking spots because we need to build a curb cut. Next slide. Then we've got to chop down the nice tree right in front of the building because we have to have a curb cut for the parking garage. Next slide. And I didn't mention that the first floor of my building is the Framers Workshop. It is a great business to have in Brookline Village, a destination business with amazing spillover effects. I love walking by it and looking at generations of people that are using that space and bringing life to Brookline Village. Next slide. That's got to go away. Next slide. This is what we get instead of the Framers Workshop. We get a curb cut and a garage door, and we cram 8 parking spots into Brookline Village. And the irony of that, of course, next slide, is that this is the number of vehicles owned by the 6 residents of my building. Our current parking requirements require the 4 units in my building that house 6 residents to have 8 parking spots when none of them have vehicles. Next slide. I want to say that this building works for Brookline. It works for the residents who live there, it works for the neighbors, and it works for the town as a whole. Next slide. But I am not making the case that this building works for everyone. You probably live in a building that looks very different from mine, and your neighbors probably live in a building that looks very different from mine. And that's okay. Next slide. Because people have very different needs, and even through their life they have different needs. My parking needs in 10 years might be very different from my parking needs today. Next slide. The demographic diversity that we all value in Brookline is made possible because of the diversity of our housing stock. Next slide. Diversity is good. We like diversity. And Article 19 makes our housing stock just that much more diverse. Instead of our current zoning code, which requires every single unit that's built in Brookline to have 2 parking spots for residents that don't require that much parking. The compromise language before you encourages that diversity. It moves the requirements more in line with what town residents actually need. And it protects the neighborhood that we love and things like trees, on-street parking, and interesting storefronts, all of which are hugely valuable to Brookline and which are unintended victims of our current zoning code. Next slide. Please join the selectmen, the advisory board, Brookline PACS, the Brookline Transportation Board, this guy behind me in the slide, and many other groups in voting yes on the compromise language for Article 19. Thank you.
Now, there was a motion for the question. We've been on this article for almost an hour. We've seen 4 slide presentations, and you've heard from some very persuasive speakers, and I cannot imagine that there are many stones left unturned. So I'll accept that motion. Is there a second? All those in favor of terminating debate, please raise your... Oh, yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Wyszynski. I have the following speakers listed in favor of the article: Ms. Pelkey, Mr. Vitolo, Ms. Hamilton, Mr. Lowy, Ms. Johnson, and Mr. Selwyn. And I have Mr. Ross listed as opposed. All those in favor of terminating debate, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries by a 2/3 vote. On the motion at the bottom of page, yes, Mr. Carroll would like a
Recorded vote, please.
recorded vote. Are there 35 people who would like a recorded vote? If so, we'll have one, and there surely are. This is Article 19, main motion. You can start the timer whenever you wish. Are you ready? This is the motion found on page 19-18. Okay, I'd like to start the timing over again. Motion is found on page 19-18. I beg your pardon? Well, I announced that the vote to terminate debate passed by a two-thirds vote. Therefore, we're now voting on the main motion, which is found on page 19-18. And the critical part is on page 19-22, which shows the reduction in the parking requirements for various types of housing. So you can start the timer whenever you wish. I remind you that for a yes vote, press the number 1, no vote, press number 2, and 3 is an abstention. Motion carries by a two-thirds vote, 146 in favor, 48 opposed, and 5 abstentions. Article 20. The motion under Article 20 is on page 20-4, moved by Mr. Wyszynski, seconded by Mr. Brown, to authorize the Board of Selectmen to enter into a contract for the services of an operator to support the town's participation in the Hubway Regional Bicycle Share Program. Mr. Wyszynski.
Hi, Neil Wyszynski for the Board of Selectmen. Hubway started in the Boston region in 2012 and has been expanding. It even expanded a little in Brookline. We went from 3 stations to 4 stations, and I think those of you who've used Hubway will agree it's a successful program, and Brookline should continue participating and hopefully try to grow the system. The system has gone out to bid for a new operator. We're hoping to change the financial model. This is a technical necessity to try to, this warrant article is a technical necessity to try and enter into a longer contract and hopefully get a better, more stable arrangement with the operator. So we hope that you'll vote favorable action and we can allow Hubway to continue and expand. Thank you.
Mr. Brown. And Ms. Hamilton, would you come forward, please?
Cliff Brown, Precinct 14, speaking on behalf of the Advisory Committee. The Advisory Committee, by a vote of 21-0 with no abstentions, urges passage of, urges favorable action on Article 20. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton.
Good evening, Heather Hamilton, Precinct 3. Speaking on behalf of the Green Caucus, we unanimously endorse favorable action on warrant Article 20. We support infrastructure that encourages a reduction in automobile ownership. Thank you.
Thank you. On the motion on page 20-4, those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Article 21. The motion offered under main motion under Article 21 is on page 21-3. A change in the zoning bylaws relating to the table of use regulations by adding use number, and the second line of that motion on the top of page 21-3, it should be 50A and not 51A. That was a Scrivener's error. It's moved by Mr. Green, seconded by Mr. Selwyn, requiring a two-thirds vote. Mr. Green.
Good evening. Mr. Moderator, Bernard Green for the Board of Selectmen. Article 21 is a zoning amendment submitted by the Planning and Community Development Department. It proposes to amend the table of use regulations in our zoning bylaw in order to add a use category for commercial and non-commercial manned aircraft landing areas. Because the use is not specifically listed in Section 4.07, Table of Uses, it's assumed to be prohibited. And this amendment would change that and allow aircraft landing areas in non-residential districts by special permit and prohibit them in residential districts. The selectmen, if town meeting approves the change, then the town would seek approval from the state's Aeronautics Division, as required by a recent case called Hanlon v. Sheffield, Town of Sheffield. Town Council has advised us that by prohibiting landing areas in residential areas and allowing special permits for non-residential areas, the Board of Appeals would be able to seek out appropriate locations for landing areas in non-residential areas. A lot of areas in that sentence. Who wrote that? At any rate, the selectmen also acknowledge that there are special circumstances, such as a visit by a prominent official or emergency, where the use would be allowed. I note that the article does not address the issue of unmanned drones. It also would not apply to medical evacuations. And one of the examples where this zoning amendment would be useful is the possibility, or not the possibility, the actuality of the upcoming U.S. Open Golf Championship in 2022. There's a fear that some might attempt to have helicopters landing in places like Cleveland Circle or Coolidge Corner when this event is held at the country club. So, the Board of Selectmen recommends favorable action by a vote of 5-0 taken on October 18, 2016 on the motion offered by the Planning Board, which is found at page 21-3 of your materials. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Selwyn. Oh, Mr. Friedman? Sorry.
Harry Friedman, Precinct 12, speaking for the Advisory Committee. For those of you who may be zoning idiots like me, there is something in the zoning code called a table of uses. And the table of uses, and you can find an example in the write-up on Article 7, basically says there are various uses, such as a restaurant or a museum or something like this, and here are the zoning districts in town where this use is allowed. And generally speaking, if something is not listed in the table of uses, it is considered prohibited. So manned aircraft landing areas are not in our table of uses as we speak, so therefore they were considered prohibited. There was a case involving the town of Sheffield, which is in southwestern Massachusetts, where they had the same thing. And unfortunately for the town of Sheffield, there is a quirk in the state law which says that if you have a zoning bylaw regarding a landing area, you have to get the zoning bylaw approved by the state DOT. And if it's not mentioned in your table of uses, you don't have a bylaw that can be approved by the state DOT. Therefore, this prohibition actually does not exist. And in the town of Sheffield, which is a rural town, somebody wanted to build a landing strip on their property, and they had enough property, and the court said, because it's not mentioned in the table of uses, you're free to build this landing area. So the planning department of the town of Brookline decided to be proactive, and they are now putting the landing area in the table of uses. Landing areas for manned aircraft will not be allowed in residential districts. They will be allowed by special permit in non-residential districts. Again, as the selectman said, we're not talking about drones, we're talking about manned aircraft. Manned aircraft would be things such as aeroplanes, autogyros, helicopters, zeppelins, hang gliders, and hot air balloons that are not moored to the ground. They are not allowed in residential areas. What about places like the country club? The country club is a residential zoned area, as is Lars Anderson, as is the municipal golf course, as is Longwood Cricket Club. So where would they be able to do it by special permit in an area that's not residential? The only place the planning department could come up with was the transfer station, i.e. the dump, and that is owned by the town. So we have some protection. So the plan is that once we pass this, assuming we pass it, and it's accepted by the Attorney General, we would then take it to the DOT, they would approve it, and we would be able to prevent manned aircraft landing areas in residential parts of town. Therefore, the advisory committee, by a vote of 21-0 with one abstention, urges favorable action.
Mr. Burstein.
Thank you. Michael A. Burstein, a town meeting member, precinct 12. Does Brookline have any emergency landing areas for aircraft? Does anyone know?
Apparently nobody does.
It seems to be slightly relevant under the warrant article.
Jocelyn Murphy, Town Council. I think I can try to answer your question. Under federal and state regulations, emergency landings are permitted. There are strict regulations that need to be followed. There does not need to be a landing area.
And that would override this
Mr. Moderator?
zoning prohibition.
Mr. Moderator?
Mr. Moderator, I also have a question for Mr. Friedman, if I may.
You have a question?
I'm wondering if he can identify what a Zeppelin is.
Aha. Well, I can identify what a Zeppelin is. They went out in 1938 with the burning of the Hindenburg. Mr. Friedman?
Harry Friedman, precinct 12. I think a Zeppelin would be included with dirigibles, so that if the Goodyear or the Hood blimp were to try and land in Brookline, it would be included with those. It's similar.
Thank you. Mr. Jones?
Yeah, Mr. Moderator.
Who are you?
I have a question.
Well, I know. Who are you?
About an event that happened. Gary Jones, Precinct 3. In Precinct 3, when you get older, you tend to forget things. But in Precinct 3, when George W. Bush was speaking at a high school in Boston, we had in our neighborhood the landing of these huge helicopters that were owned by the Secret Service. And some of you may remember it, but we in our neighborhood remember it very well. Chimneys were being toppled and roofs were toppled and cars were jobbled and people were upset. And I believe some firemen in Brookline, when they landed in Northeastern Field, two of these huge helicopters with the big props generating this wind, knocked over the dugouts and hit firemen. And what happens in an event like that? Is that an emergency? Because they simply made a mistake. They were landing in town and they were simply confused about where they were going. And they did a lot of damage, by the way.
Jocelyn Murphy, Town Council. I have a particular and intimate knowledge of that case because on behalf of the town, I filed a complaint suing the United States government and Northeastern University for the damage that was caused, the injuries that were caused to the 4 firefighters who were grievously injured as a result of that incident. The Secret Service organized that flight. It was a pair of dual-rotor Chinook helicopters, which had no business being flying over Nickerson Field, which interestingly has an artificial turf surface. I'm simply telling a story, Mr. Moderator, because it's a good one. The turf is an artificial field. In the deposition of the pilot of the first Chinook helicopter, I asked him whether he had ever seen the field before, and he said, he was a Marine, he said, "No, ma'am." And I said, in the deposition of the chief Secret Service agent who organized the flight, what steps did you take to ensure the safety of the personnel on the ground? And she couldn't answer the question. The best part of the story is that my father was a professor of aeronautics at MIT, and he was my expert witness. And it cost the town lunch at a local restaurant. I asked him to tell me everything he knew about downdraft. In any event, there are federal regulations that permit landings of the president and his entourage.
Were you successful in getting money?
We recovered every cent.
Thank you.
On the motion on page 21-3, thank you very much, Ms. Murphy. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Article 22. The motion offered under, actually there are two motions offered under Article 22. They're found on the yellow supplement, number 3, pages 2 dash, let's see now, page 2 through page 5, page 6. And these motions are moved by Mr. Selwyn and seconded by Mr. Green. This actually constitutes a division of the question. We don't ordinarily have two main motions under a single article, but for reasons that Mr. Benka will undoubtedly explain, it's been broken down into two motions, and if that's acceptable to the body, we will move forward on that basis. Mr. Benka apparently is acceptable to the body. Mr. Saltzman, would you come forward, please?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dick Benka, Chair of the Moderators Committee on Zoning FAR. This article has been broken into two votes because there are somewhat different issues that are posed under each of the two votes. Let me start first with the core recommendation of vote 1 and then go on to vote 2, and then I'll explain why concerns about the impact of Article 22 on existing homeowners are misplaced. You have before you the result of months of work by a very competent committee, and I thank them. A unanimous Board of Selectmen and a virtually unanimous advisory committee urge favorable action on both vote 1 and vote 2. By way of background, floor area ratio, or FAR, is an important way that we regulate the bulk of buildings in town. It is the ratio of the allowable floor area of a building to the size of the lot on which that building sits. But with regard to basements and attics, we only include so-called finished space in the floor area calculation. Thus, as our bylaw now stands, an unfinished basement or attic of unlimited size can be constructed or added without any zoning review of its bulk and without any resulting notice to abutters or town meeting members. Because so-called unfinished basement and attics are totally ignored for FAR purposes when building permits are issued, structures can be utterly out of scale with the neighborhood. Moreover, in Brookline, a basement can essentially be a walkout first floor because we define basements to be any space which is even partly below grade. Allowing basements and attics to be finished up to 150% of FAR, as we do now, has proven to be a de facto invitation to construct houses that are 50% larger than otherwise allowed. Under the existing bylaw, the unfinished space can be finished legally after 10 years or illegally before that time. But from day one, neighborhoods have to deal with buildings on steroids. Town meeting in November 2015 accordingly charged the Moderators Committee with finding a solution that would address this McMansion loophole. We learned from the Deputy Building Commissioner that 90% of new houses involve attics and or basements that when finished would push the house over the allowable FAR. A developer admitted that other developers, though not her, turn unfinished basements and attics into habitable space before the legally required 10-year waiting period is up. Indeed, town meeting members were shown a new home where the developer had already cut the wallboard to finish the attic and told them that he'd install it after the building department's occupancy inspection. The town has gone to the Supreme Judicial Court twice over a so-called attic that was labeled the master bedroom on the architect's plans that the developer had to turn over in litigation. We learned of so-called attic and basement storage areas with 8-foot ceilings, full-length windows, formal entrances, and fireplaces. The Deputy Building Commissioner has described attic space with easily removable rafters at 6 feet of height and 10-foot high basement space with removable dummy flooring 4 feet off the ground, creating the fiction of a room that is only 6 feet high. The core of Vote 1, which is paragraph N on the second yellow page, would require a special permit to construct new finished or unfinished space that's large enough to be made habitable, in essence, that substantially meets state dimensional standards for habitability, where that space, if and when finished, would cause the house to exceed the allowable FAR. Design review would require that any such construction be consistent in scale with the neighborhood. We essentially treat finished and unfinished space uniformly, recognizing that they add the same bulk to the neighborhood. And following up on the suggestion of the Planning Department, Article 22 would reduce the basement and attic bonus from 150% to 130% to reduce even further the de facto invitation to build the most out-of-scale buildings. Let me turn to Vote 2. Vote 2 would eliminate the FAR exemption in T, which is 2-family, F, 3-family, and M, multifamily districts. Why? These are the zoning districts that already have the very highest base FARs, 0.75 to 1.0 in the T districts, 1.0 in F districts, and up to 1.5 where there can be exemptions in M districts. There is the potential for extraordinary build-out even without the exemptions. Take a T5 district with an FAR of 1.0. With even a 30% basement and attic exemption, you could theoretically build a 7,800 square foot building on a 6,000 square foot lot, to be finished legally after 10 years or illegally before that. The contrast with existing density in these districts is alarming. Today, the average existing FAR in T districts for single and 2-family homes is only 55 to 68% of the allowed base FAR. So even without the exemptions, you're talking potential density that is 50% or more greater than now exists. With the exemptions, you're talking density that could be about 2.5 times what now exists. And you can see what's already happened, with neighborhood activists being compelled to pursue downzoning or neighborhood conservation districts in response. Similar issues exist in F and M districts with their high base FARs. Single and 2-family homes average only 70 to 75% of the base FAR, so you're talking potential density increases of 1/3 or more even without the exemptions, or of 75 to 80% with the exemptions. With Vote 2, you get rid of the de facto invitation for teardowns and build-outs exceeding the already substantial potential for greater density in these districts. It's a matter of the fabric of our neighborhoods, demands on town and school services, and environmental responsibility. Now, finally, on to the major concern that's been expressed: the fear that existing homeowners couldn't even finish their existing basements or attics. The building department has confirmed that large unfinished basements and attics in existing properties would constitute pre-existing nonconformities, because they were built without the special permit, we would now require for corresponding new spaces, as I've described. You would think that's a bad thing, but it's not. Under Section 8.02.2 of our existing zoning bylaw, such pre-existing non-conforming spaces are protected. They can be extended or altered as long as the zoning nonconformity is not increased. And the building department is in agreement that finishing those existing basement and attic spaces does not increase the zoning nonconformity and thus will be permitted. The protection applies regardless of the zoning district or the type of property. It applies to one family, two family, three family, or multifamily homes in S or T or F or M districts. And I would just add as an aside, it unfortunately has to apply to buildings built within the last 10 years. In addition, under state statutory and case law, for one and two family homes in any district, a zoning nonconformity can even be increased as long as it's not substantially more detrimental to the neighborhood. An example. Many of you have received emails from Jenny Green, and a group of us, including the Deputy Building Commissioner, reviewed her case with her. It's the perfect storm. It's a three-family house, and it's in a T district, non-conforming as to both FAR and use. She would actually be able to finish more of her existing basement and attic space under Article 22 than she would without it, because all non-conforming space can be finished, and not just up to 150% of FAR. But that's okay, because that space already exists and the bulk of her building isn't being increased. For buildings where the unfinished basement and attic space would not push the building over the allowable FAR, the owners can finish out that space or indeed add additions because they, by definition, would be under the allowable FAR. And as I've noted, this is the typical single or two family building in T, F, and M districts. Because the allowable FAR is already so high in districts and the average existing density is so modest, existing buildings could typically be increased by 1/3 or 1/2 or more, even without the exemptions. To conclude, you have the committee's best effort to do what town meeting asked us to do and to deal with festering problems. We've had no suggestions of anything better. Overbuilt housing is a problem from Ackers Avenue to Sergeant Beechwood. This is our best shot to protect families in existing homes while putting the brakes on developers who are taking advantage of our existing bylaws. Please vote favorable action on both parts of Article 22. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Saltzman.
Good evening. I'm Dan Saltzman, Precinct 6. Ladies and gentlemen, to say I'm up here as an opponent to Article 22 is really not 100% accurate. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Dick Benka, the chair of the Moderators Committee that produced this article, and all the other people on that committee. They should be applauded for their efforts. There's no doubt about that. I'm not even really up here necessarily to dispute really a whole lot of what Dick said. So what am I doing here? It's a good question. First and foremost, I'll say that I am opposed to the second part of Article 22's split vote. I'm not going to ask you to vote a certain way in the first part. I'm going to tell you what I have learned, and I want you to think about it and think about how you can vote on that first part. Think about how it affects your precinct, your neighbors. So it's the first part that I want to get into in terms of how I've arrived at my decision. Just 3 weeks ago, Dick had mentioned Jenny Green. She came to me. She lives in my precinct as a neighbor of mine, and she said that she went to the building department to go forward with some plans that they had come up with, and they were told that they wouldn't be able to do this because of Article 22. She contacted me, and I explained to her that I didn't think that that article would have that impact. I didn't think that that's what should happen from what I knew about it. But then another constituent came to me with what they thought was a similar situation. The building department had also told them that because of Article 22, they would not be able to go forward with some plans that they had. So I was growing concerned. I set out to learn something a little bit more about this very complex zoning article. So I read and I reread the article and some of our zoning bylaw. Didn't really understand the totality of it at that point. I asked around to people that I thought that might know, didn't really get satisfactory answers. I kind of concluded a couple of things from this preliminary analysis. First of all, this stuff is really complicated, as we all know. Regardless of these complications that were clouding my understanding of it, what was clear is that I didn't like these outcomes that I was hearing from my neighbors. So I invited these two constituents to speak against the article at the BNA TMMA League of Women Voters warrant article forum that was held on the 10th. I listened to that discussion. I learned from it. I spoke with Dick afterwards. Still not 100% understanding the outcome that we had heard from these two of my constituents. Then discussed the article at the Precinct 6 warrant article review that we had a few days later. And it just didn't seem that anybody truly understood what the outcome should be and whether or not what I was hearing from my constituents was the right thing. So frustrated and confused, I then sat down with Dick, Mike Yanovich, the building committee of the building department, another town meeting member, and the two constituents who brought this to my attention. It was a great meeting. We sat there for like 2 hours, and I began to understand a little bit of what was going on. Now, throughout that meeting, there were definitely times where these two incredibly smart people that know so much about the zoning, Mike and Dick, there were still times where they didn't seem to be on the same page. But what became clear is that this idea of the pre-existing non-conforming, if you found yourself in that boat of being pre-existing non-conforming, you were in great shape. If you ended up not like that, there was a chance that you would actually be worse off than those who were pre-existing non-conforming. It's kind of hard to understand, and it took a little while for that to sink in. Those not fortunate enough to be non-conforming with the passage of Article 22 could stand to lose some of their ability to expand. To me, that didn't seem right. And I want you to think about that. Does that make sense to you when you're going to vote on this? So I went and I looked at some other properties, and I saw that, again, some win and some lose. Do we solve the problem of McMansions? I think we very well make a lot of inroads towards that. There's no doubt about it. I accept that this goes a long way to solving that problem, but it also causes problems for other people who happen to be conforming after this article is passed. It's counterintuitive, but it's what it is. That, ironically, as Dick said, is why Jenny Green, who was the one who got me into this in the first place, it turns out will be better off because of this article. She will not be hindered by it, but others will be. And that's hard to understand. And it's why I am going to vote no on the first part of this article. There's too much confusion for me. It's too great of potential for burden on the residents in my precinct. I don't know about your precinct because it's way too complicated for me to have sat down and looked into it for everybody. You have to ask yourself, do I understand this? How is it going to affect my precinct? If the benefits of this article outweigh the burden on your constituents, you vote accordingly. Now, about the second vote, T, F, and M districts, I think, should be allowed to expand in the same way that others can, for those that are not looking to change the envelope. It's the way I see it. The point is more clear to me than in the first part. I think that I urge you to vote no action on the second part, and I urge you to just consider how you're going to vote on that first part. What's going to make sense to you? What's going to make sense to the people that you represent? If you're going to vote for it, you're going to vote for it, and I hope you understand it. I hope you will vote against the second part of Article 22. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you. Lee Sullivan, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 13. I'm a member of the Advisory Committee, and I'm speaking for the Advisory Committee, which by a nearly unanimous vote is urging favorable action on both the first and the second vote. I was the petitioner of Article 12 in November 2015, which led to the creation of the Moderators Committee. So this is an issue I have been living with for some time. I think quite frankly, that the concerns being expressed by Mr. Salzman are somewhat misplaced. This article will have virtually no impact on existing homeowners because, for the most part, it allows expansion within the existing building envelope. In the case of S districts, it allows expansion beyond FAR. For example, if you wanted to put an addition on a house that exceeds FAR, by special permit. It doesn't prohibit it. This was a major difference between what we tried to do last year, which had an absolute limit of FAR, and what we're doing now, which allows additions by special permit. This means that there's a design review and abutters are notified if the building envelope is going to be increased. In the case of T districts, TF and N districts, there are almost 1,000 single-family homes in the town of Brookline that are in these 2, 3, and multifamily districts. The vast majority of these are well under FAR. And as Dick explained, they can be expanded up to in typically 50% or more while remaining under FAR. And in the case of, I looked at the data for these, and I found that many of the ones that were already over FAR had already finished out their basements, so that they effectively had pretty much done what they could do within the existing building envelope. Since 2002, this issue has come up multiple times and in multiple forms in town meeting. In the form of warrant articles aimed specifically at addressing the McMansion issue, in the form of local historic districts, neighborhood conservation districts. The attempt in 2002 was thwarted by the Attorney General because we were attempting to make a distinction between new and existing houses, and the Attorney General found that was discriminatory and rejected the attempt. Through several recent court cases and some very creative work that I think that the Moderators Committee did, we have effectively accomplished pretty much what we tried to do in 2002. We're going to effectively require that developers get special permits, subject themselves to design review, and notify abutters for projects that, with the inclusion of potentially habitable space, exceed FAR. We're going to also, we've come up with a structure that effectively protects virtually every pre-existing structure and existing owner. This is what we tried to do in 2002. I think we figured out a way to do it. I think it will be effective. The advisory committee, by a vote of 24 in favor with 3 abstentions, recommends favorable action on the first vote, and by a vote of 22 in favor, 1 against, and 4 abstentions, recommends favorable action on the second vote. I think this is a good solution. I think it's fair to everybody. I think it protects virtually everybody, if not everybody, and I urge you to support it. Thank you.
Ms. Hamlin?
Linda Hamlin, speaking for the Planning Board. I have a couple pages here of things that I wrote down, and maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. This is so confusing, and I'm on the Planning Board and have been for years. I was on the committee, the Moderators Committee for this. I was confused when I was on the committee. I'm even more confused now after hearing Mr. Benka, Mr. Saltzman, because there are a lot of words being thrown around. I can throw this up in the air now. there's a lot of words here that make this issue very complex and unstable. We're throwing around words like pre-existing nonconformity, and I am worried about those people that, in this new case law, that already have a nonconforming house, and so they can make it even more nonconforming. It's true. It's bizarre. That does put the burden on people that have a conforming, that have less conformity. I want to ask Mr. Benka now if it means that if a person has, an owner, has a home that is a pre-existing nonconformity, wants to expand under these new state rules, if it's substantially non-detrimental, does it go through a special permit process? Do you understand what that would mean for a huge number of our owners here in Brookline? Anyone that has a house that has a pre-existing nonconformity but needs to prove that it's substantially not detrimental to the neighborhood means the increase on the caseload for our building department, for our planning department, of going through the special permit process to determine whether this is substantially not detrimental is incredible. The planning board voted no action on Article 22 and preferred to refer it back to a moderator's committee, maybe not the same one, probably not the same one, on zoning for presentation to the Springtown meeting. I think we stated.
Of course, you don't have a referral vote before you.
Okay. What's that?
There's no referral vote before the body.
Okay. Well, then we can't do that. I'm learning. So we'll keep it with no action. We are worried. There's a few things in here I can say. We're worried about the complexity of this proposal. We are worried about the unintended consequences.
Well, you know, you've used up your 3 minutes, Ms. Hanlon.
Okay. I think I've said enough, actually.
Well, fine.
I think that's my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. And Ms. Stanford, would you please come forward?
Bernard Green for the Board of Selectmen. I hate to add to the confusion, but, you know, one resident has stated in connection with warrant Article 22, let me quote, "Several very smart people intimately involved in this process have commented to me how highly technical and incredibly complicated this article is." So if you are like me, not being one of those very smart people intimately involved in this process, warrant Article 22 is a problem. But fortunately, Dick Benka, in my opinion, gave a fairly good explanation of this. And what I see is a difference between understanding the wording of an article and, for example, Dick Benka's presentation, sort of intellectually, and being able to understand all the implications of that. And the latter is where I think, I admit, I may have a problem. But let me proceed on. As you know, as Dick stated, this article seeks to primarily to prevent the construction of overly large single-family homes out of character with the surrounding neighborhood. And currently unfinished basements and attics are not counted towards the FAR, floor area ratio. But 10 years after the initial construction of a home, they can be finished and made habitable, as we discussed earlier. Warrant Article 22 was presented to the Board of Selectmen on November 1st with the changes suggested by the advisory committee, and we accepted that. But because of the complexity that I think I conveyed, I think the reason for this was because of the complexity. We agreed to accept the bifurcation of the warrant article into 2 votes, addressing different aspects of the problem. I also have a lot of writing about what those 2 votes are. I'm not going to waste your time with that because they have been discussed adequately already. But so on November 15th, yesterday, the Board of Selectmen reconsidered warrant Article 22 and accepted the bifurcation of the 2 votes and unanimously voted favorable action on both Vote 1 and Vote 2, or Thing 1 and Thing 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stanford.
Claire Stamfer, Precinct 5. Mr. Moderator and select persons, advisory board, fellow town meeting members, please support Article 22 to protect Brookline's livable neighborhoods. By closing the McMansion loophole, Article 22 helps our town departments and committees enforce our zoning regulations. Article 22 thus protects our open and green spaces and our property values. Unfortunately, residences have been approved that are actually 150% of FAR because allegedly non-habitable space has not been included in the FAR calculation. This has resulted in homes that are disproportionately large, which detracts from the streetscape and deprives other lots of their rights to sunshine. Overbuilding also increases impermeable surface area, which all citizens end up paying for through fees to manage stormwater and sewer. Neighbors who were already paying high Brookline taxes have had to go to the additional expense of hiring lawyers to present their case to town committees that the zoning regulations should be upheld. In the case, for example, of 33 Sergeant Beechwood, a plan was presented to the town and was noted to be 150% of FAR and not approved. The developer soon returned with the same plan, but with the uses of the area erased and called attic and basement. And then it was approved. Article 22 seeks to address these inconsistencies and injustices. Article 22 states that areas that essentially meet building standards for habitable space and could be finished if desired should count in the FAR as potentially habitable space, regardless of whether or not the developer actually finishes them. Article 22 seeks to protect our neighborhoods and to enforce our zoning regulations. Article 22 does not prohibit conversions of existing interior spaces, such as attics and basements, for example, to habitable uses. To the contrary, Article 22 does allow for the conversion of existing interior spaces to make them habitable. Article 22 enables our town to uphold its zoning laws and allows for conversion of interior non-habitable space to habitable space. Both of these are necessary to preserve our neighborhoods. Please vote favorable action for both parts of Article 22.
Thank you, Mr. Bassett.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. John Bassett, Precinct 6. I live near here, right across from Jenny Green, as a matter of fact. I'm concerned also to protect the possibility of people expanding in place. Several questions. I understand it's not proper or legal to essentially discriminate against new construction by having different rules for new construction. Was it ever considered, since the definition of gross floor area is being substantially changed and increased by adding this space, to at the same time allow for higher maximum gross floor areas in some of the districts like the T, F, and M districts. Was that ever considered? Would it make a difference? I can't, well, where in, I think we're voting on the yellow supplement. The two votes are in the yellow supplement.
You are.
Where in the yellow supplement does it talk about the rights of people to finish basements and attics in existing without altering exterior dimensions? And is there a distinction between whether the property is presently conforming or not?
Whoa,
conforming?
Mr. Bassett, I think you better take one question at a time, and I think Mr. Benka is in the best position to respond to your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, Mr. Bassett, this article does not change the definition of gross floor area. Article 12, which was before the spring town meeting, or before the November town meeting last year, did do that. It included both finished and non-habitable space, along with, I'm sorry, it included both unfinished / non-habitable space in the definition of gross floor area, along with finished / habitable space. This doesn't do that because of the problems that created with respect to the flexibility that would have been allowed under that change. All this does is to say that if unfinished space or finished space is being added, if that volume is being added, that if finished would exceed the allowable FAR, the construction of that space has to undergo design review. So we have not changed the definition of gross floor area in this article, and therefore there really isn't any need to change the allowable FAR in T or F or M or any districts. With respect to your second question, where in here does it say, where in the article does it say that pre-existing non-conforming spaces will be protected? It doesn't say that. That is in section 8.02.2 of our zoning bylaw, an existing provision in the zoning bylaw, which we're not fiddling with. Finally, let me just respond to the criticism of the term substantially more detrimental. The provision allowing the expansion or the increase of non-conforming area if it is not substantially more detrimental to the neighborhood is not something that the Moderators Committee created. It's not something that is in our zoning bylaw. That is under state law, under two cases recently interpreting Chapter 40A, Section 6 of the state zoning statutes, the Gale and Diedrich cases. Those requirements and that substantially more detrimental test is something that is a function of state law and not anything that we've done.
Mr. Richmond?
Well, that was a good segue. Clint Richmond, Precinct 6.
Who are you?
Clint Richmond, Precinct 6 again.
I'm sorry?
My question was about detrimental, because I was wondering how that was defined, and I was inspired by Ms. Hamlin's comments that, you know, making that determination as a planning board or a zoning board could be, it seems so subjective. I don't know how it actually functions in practice and whether or not it's something we want to invite.
Mr. Benka, you might as well stay up at the microphone here. I think you may be the only one in the auditorium who can answer some of these questions.
Yeah, thank you. We've actually, the Moderators Committee in Article 22 included a provision that is intended to provide guidance to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and we recognize that the term substantially more detrimental is a provision that is a creature of state law, and what we've said in Article 22 is that we would ask that the Zoning Board of Appeals be guided by the structure of what we've done in Section 5.22 with regard to that question. We can't mandate the Zoning Board of Appeals determinations, but we've urged them to be guided by our standards in the zoning bylaw for increases and for FAR that's allowable in various districts.
Quick follow-up, if I may, Mr. Moderator. So is that something, I mean, I'm just imagining a scenario here. So I'm in a butter, and my neighbor's doing something I don't like. Would it be up to me, incumbent on me, to say, I think this new development is substantially detrimental, or is it something that the zoning board could determine on its own without any input from abutters? I mean, what would sort of be the role there?
Well, I mean, I think, and if there's somebody from the ZBA who can respond, but as a practical matter, I think the issue would be raised by an abutter, but ultimately it is the determination of the ZBA.
Mr. Ananian?
Hello, Scott Ananian, Precinct 10. So I represent Precinct 10, which is almost entirely T5, T6, and M. And matter of fact, my neighborhood, Griggs Park, is T6. And I'm concerned that that especially Question 2 seems to unfairly take away some privileges that other zoning districts have. We are going to deny some single and two-family homeowners the right to do renovations and additions above the FAR, while other zoning districts still have that. And current homeowners who bought their houses under the current zoning laws are going to find that their ability to do what they had planned with their house is going to be affected, and they probably are sitting at home completely unaware of this, and potentially losing property value. So I do like the pre-existing non-conforming loophole. It's a nice bit of state law, and you all probably will hear it again when the EV articles return to spring town meeting. But in that case, almost none of you have EV chargers in your garages, so you're all pre-existing non-conforming for that. In the case of this article, almost all of my constituents, because the FAR ratios in Zone T5 and T6 are so generous, almost all my constituents are not non-conforming, they're conforming, and so they're going to be unfairly affected by these changes. So I'm uncertain about the first part of this question, but I would certainly urge a vote of no action on Question 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ananian. Actually, we looked at one of the properties on Griggs Terrace. There was a particular individual who raised issues about that, and that property actually reflected the general conditions in T districts, which are that the average properties now in T districts are well below the allowable FAR, because the FAR, that the potential build-out in T districts, even without the exemptions, is so high.
I understand. My point is that there's a difference between mostly under and completely under, right?
Right.
There are some people who are going to be unpleasantly affected.
Well, you know, all we have are the numbers. We have the data, and let me give you. I mean, in fact, this case sort of presents the pros and the cons of Vote 2. The property is a 5,700 square foot property, 0.75 FAR. Without any exemption, it can build out to about 4,200 square feet. It's now about 2,800 square feet, which is about 67% of the allowable build out without any exemption. So it could increase by about 50% without any exemptions at all, either finishing the basement, finishing the attic, expanding the attic, putting a new addition on the back. That property sits next to another property that could theoretically be subdivided, and under the existing bylaw with even a 1.3 basement and attic exemption, you could put a 6,700 square foot building in on a 6,000 square foot lot, whereas the building now, this particular one we looked at, is 2,800 square feet. So it could be 2.5 times the size of the building next door, which is a typical building in that neighborhood. That's the trade-off the town meeting has to decide with regard to Vote 2 and T districts.
Ms. Frawley?
You know, that's why we offered Vote 2.
Ms. Frawley?
Thank you, Regina Frawley from Precinct 16. I don't think anybody hates McMansions more than I do, but I live in a precinct with such small lots and such small footprints. My exterior footprint is around 720 square feet. My interior is around 620 square feet. I have 2 floors and a hip roof, so there's no attic, there's crawl space. I don't have interior air conditioning. My most comfortable place on earth is down in the basement mostly from April through the fall. It would be great if I had a bathroom there. A lot of my neighbors talk about things like that. And I don't understand how this article, if it were to pass, is going to affect people in my neighborhood like me. We don't have enough land to expand. We don't do additions. We just would like to use our entire space where we can. So can you help me understand what would happen if I put even a toilet and some space heater there?
Mr. Benko?
Yeah, well, you're in an S district.
S7,
Right.
but there's only one house on the whole street that's 7. Everybody else is lower.
Right. You're in an S district. This makes no changes in S districts other than potentially changing the basement and attic build-out from 150 to 100.
Could you talk in the microphone, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. You are in an S district. Nothing changes in S districts except that Vote 1 would reduce the potential build-out of basements and attics from 150% to 130% in S districts. That is designed, the purpose of that was sort of reducing the de facto invitation to build new houses to 150%. I don't know what your FAR is, but the change from
Neither do I.
No, but how you compare to that. But the change from 150% to 130% shouldn't make any difference, because if you're up to 130%, you're already non-conforming, and therefore you're protected by our zoning bylaw and by state law. I suspect that if you're under 100%, you could finish out your basement up to 130%.
Well, I think speculating about specific cases like this is not going to help the body.
Well, it's just that I was called by different neighbors with the same question.
Thank you. Mr. Ross?
So my
Yes,
neighborhood
thank you,
wants to
Mr.
know how it
Moderator.
would affect us.
Joe Ross, Precinct 12. I have 2 questions. First, if this has been explained, I must have missed it. Why are there 2 votes? Second question, I really don't, think I understand what Vote 1 does, but I'm not really quite sure I understand what Vote 2 does.
Well, Mr. Benka spent 2 or 3 minutes telling us about the distinction between the 2 votes, and you must have missed it, Mr. Ross. But can you succinctly help Mr. Ross?
Let me just say, there were concerns expressed about the impact of Article 22 on T districts, even though some of us felt, or I felt, and others felt that for the reasons I've expressed, those concerns are really not warranted. I decided to split the vote and offer the split vote so that those concerns about T districts would not drag down what is in Vote 1, which is what's really focused on addressing the McMansions. Vote 2 is focused on addressing the issues that came up with respect to T districts and the build-out and the potential build-out, and what people have seen happening in T districts, which exist in 15 out of the 16 precincts of our town.
Ms. Khan?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Janice Khan, Precinct 15. So when we were discussing warrant Article 19 on parking, one of the things that has really stuck with me since that discussion has been the idea that we do, in fact, have a very complex zoning bylaw. It is, by all accounts, probably the most complex in the Commonwealth. And tweaking one part may, in fact, have consequences that we don't anticipate. And I'm just wondering, and so I hesitated supporting that because of that possibility. And I'm thinking that one of the ways to balance that, where this was described as a giveaway, 19 was described as a giveaway to developers, that this in fact might serve as a balancing force within our zoning bylaws to maybe step that back a little. And I wondered what you might think about that, since it affects largely the same
I wasn't
area.
sure where you were going with that question, but I thank you.
So, yeah. So
No, look, this is really designed to address the gaming of our zoning bylaw. We've tried to do it. We started trying to do it in 2002. We were struck down by the Attorney General. We tried again with a different approach that has proven ineffective. We've worked on this for almost a year, and we had some very competent and committed people working on it. And let me just add Mike Yanovich, from the Deputy Building Commissioner from the Building Department, who was remarkably helpful and committed in this process, and I do want to thank him.
There was a motion for the question. I have no one else on the speakers list, but you can see who's standing at the microphone: Mr. Vitolo, Mr. Goldstein, Ms. Hummel, and Mr. Bors. Is there a second to the motion for the question? This is a motion to terminate debate. Is there a second? Oh, thank you. All those in favor of terminating debate, please raise your hands. Those opposed, motion fails. Mr. Vitolo.
Tommy Vitolo, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 6. Mr. Moderator, as we've heard, homes built within the last 10 years may have built some unfinished space with a 10-year waiting period, and I'm hoping that the Building Department can explain what happens to those newly built homes and that unfinished space. Do they still have to wait for the 10 years? I'd like the Building Department, if possible, to opine.
Well, Mr. Benka
maybe
could
for some
probably answer that
variety
question.
on viewpoints.
I've actually already addressed that issue, but
Hey, Mr. Allen.
I don't recall, Robert Allen, Precinct 16, I don't recall a prior time when a department head was asked to speak and the petitioner came up and spoke, when a department head is here to speak.
Well, we'll hear from the department head.
Thank you.
It's a fair point, Mr. Allen. You heard the question, sir?
Yes, Mr. Moderator, thank you. So essentially, because of
who are you and what's
Mike
your
Yanovich, Deputy Building Commissioner from the Building Department. Due to the non-conforming nature, so just for a point of clarity, there are two primary ways to become non-conforming. Either your structure existed prior to the existence of the bylaw, or your structure existed prior to the amendment to a bylaw that affects your structure. So essentially, that 10-year waiting period, let's say a house came in 2 years ago and was built out to the FAR that they are allowed, 100% FAR, and they have this large attic and large basement that are not counted to its FAR now. Because we're saying that this space is now counted, because new structures require special permits, that house that was built 2 years ago or a year ago will not have to wait, because we're calling that space pre-existing non-conforming by requiring new structures to gain special permits for that space today.
Thank you. Ms. Hummel, you might as well take a seat in the front row.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Amy Hummel, Town Meeting Member from Precinct 12. I appreciate the overarching purpose of this particular warrant article, but I still am concerned and a little confused by different things I've heard tonight about specifically the first part of it, in the pre-existing non-conforming homes, families trying to change simply existing attic space, existing basement space. I understand that it can still be done, but right now it's 150% by right. And it sounds like it's not just the same, it'll be okay. In fact, it sounds like those families will have to go through the special permit process, which is involved getting usually surveys of the area and all sorts of other gyrations going through the town process, which adds a lot of time and angst. So is that in fact the case, or is it still by
is
right?
shaking his head no, so
But I thought I heard that earlier this evening, which is why I'm very confused.
Mike Yanovich, Deputy Building Commissioner. Actually, it frees up, once again, it frees up that space to be finished as of right.
But currently it is as of right 150%. And so if we winnow it even down to 130, but I thought that I heard that I thought that in response to another question, that was yes, but through special permit process.
It would be special permit process if you're creating new space.
So if it's currently unfinished space, right now it's as of right, and there is no special permit process. But if you did it after, say, this warrant article passes, then in fact it does become a special permit process. So it is.
It would not. And here's the complexity. So the attic space being there, you could do it as of right. We're going to hand you a building permit. The significance comes in, now the nonconformity is FAR. So in these Galen Diedrich cases that have come before the SJC, the appeals court in the SJC, what happens is somebody could be 155% with their attic and basement and propose an exterior addition. That exterior addition brings them to 165%, which is nowhere near what our bylaw would allow today. We cannot require a variance. We require a special permit and a Section 6 finding at that point, which comes back to the point of substantial detriment. And substantial detriment is interpreted by the courts. They give the town deference in determining substantial detriment. And it's the neighborhood, unfortunately. It's not one neighbor. It's not one street. The substantial detriment goes back to the neighborhood.
Sure. So, okay, so that was my main question, because it is concerning to me when I hear special permit and I know what's involved with that. It just adds a lot to people who aren't trying to increase their footprint, just simply trying to use the space that they have that doesn't happen to be finished already. And it sounds like they will not have to go through the entire planning process to get that done.
No, we're going
They
to have
just
a
have to
run on
come
attic
to
and
you.
basement permits is what
Okay.
we're going to have.
Yeah, you will. Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Boers.
Harry Boers, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 3. Can't hear me? Is that better? Yes. Okay. Harry Boers, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 3. I live in a T district. I also live in an NCD. I think the only real, for lack of a better term, NCD that the town has at this point. And one of the reasons that we went to an NCD was because we are in a T district, and what we learned is that the T district may very well be the most vulnerable sort of district because of the FAR. Small lots, and these houses can build out now to an FAR of 1. What happened in our neighborhood, and nobody was built out nearly to that extent, a developer came in and put in a house, now 8,300 square feet, affectionately referred to as the cruise ship. I will say the people that live there now are absolutely lovely, lovely people. We all enjoy them quite a bit. When I can think of some way to describe the developer, I'll get back to you later. But what we wound up was this huge monstrosity, and we realized something needed to be done. Our approach was an NCD, and it has a number of other elements in it that this certainly wouldn't, but what it made very clear was how vulnerable the T districts are, how big they can become, how quickly they can get big, and how quickly you can lose a neighborhood. And while this may not, Article 22 may not be perfect, it's not going to give you everything. It's a step in the right direction, and I will enthusiastically vote favorable action on the first part and the second part. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're trying again to call the question.
One last question. Oh, I can't. No?
I actually did call on you, so go ahead.
So sorry, everybody. I think...
Who are you?
Faith Michaels, Precinct 5. I think the idea behind this is a very good one, but I would like to hear from the building department about the practical reality of putting this into practice.
Yes, philosophically.
All right. Well, again, we're not taking a stance on this. Inevitably, we're the enforcement arm. We're the ones that have to deal with it on a daily basis. Is it complex? Absolutely. It's probably, of the multiple municipalities I've worked in, this is the most complex bylaw to have to interpret that I've ever had to deal with. However, as I said to the selectmen, I said we'll take the hand dealt and we'll let the chips fall where they may, and inevitably we have to enforce what's passed. Is it a step in the right direction? Absolutely. Is it going to be difficult? Absolutely. I think Dan Bennett, the building commissioner, and I have already spent, since the advertisement of this, multiple mornings at the counter, going over what does this mean for this project. Then in the afternoon, what does it mean for this particular project? So it will be difficult. It will take some time to get used to, but inevitably it will add to the workload. But I think it's a step in the right direction. It's going to be difficult.
Thank you. You don't have to call the question. There's no one, believe it or not, no one else left at the microphones. So on the, if there are 35 people that want a recorded vote on, we'll take one on both these motions. So stand if you want a recorded vote on both motions, and there are 35 people. So this is Article 22, motion number 1. Page, why don't you just say, motion number 1. Okay, you may now vote. Motion carries by a vote of 169 in favor, 18 opposed, and 12 abstentions. We will now deal with vote 2 on page 5 of the yellow supplement at the bottom. Whenever you're ready, this is Article 22, vote 2. You may now vote. Motion carries by a vote of 156 in favor, 27 opposed, and 19 abstentions. We now turn to our next controversial subject, which is leaf blowers. Articles 23 and 24 deal with the subject of leaf blowers. We will debate them both together. The motion under Article 23 is found on the green supplement, pages 5 to 10. Moved by Mr. Doggett, seconded by Ms. Benka. Excuse me. And the motion under Article 24 is found on the purple, supplement, number 1, pages 4 and 5 that has to do with the administration of the leaf blower bylaw. It's a resolution. The first is a bylaw amendment, and this is a resolution. It's also moved by Mr. Doggett, seconded by Ms. Benka. We have a single debate on both articles. Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. John Doggett, Precinct 13, and Chair of the Moderators Committee on Leaf Blowers. I've got the slides, please. Thank you. Before I start, I would like to thank all the committee members for their hard work and diligence and stamina for 17 meetings, 2 public hearings, and an outdoor demonstration of leaf blowers at Lars Anderson Park. Also, thanks to many people who've contributed to the committee's efforts. Many Brookline residents for their input, the town administrator, the information technology director, the police chief and his staff, town council, health department director, the DPW commissioner, and particularly the director of Parks and Open Space Division with her staff, and the Lars Anderson's Auto Museum director. Thank you all for your participation and support. Slide 2, please. A year ago, this body considered Article 10 a proposal to ban gas-powered leaf blowers, which generated significant debate. With an absence of clear consensus, Article 10 was referred to a Moderators Committee, that's us, with a charge to review, report, and if indicated, propose changes to leaf blower regulations. The committee believes it has produced a better and a greener bylaw under Article 23, combined with improved enforcement proposal contained in Article 24. Slide, please. The most meaningful provision in Article 23 is to make the property owner, that includes homeowner, condo associations, apartment manager, and long-term tenants, jointly responsible with their contractor for violations of the bylaw. Both will be fined equally for persistent violations. Article 23 also contains some smaller changes to our current bylaw to increase the summer quiet period, so the fall cleanup now starts October 1st, a reduction in permitted hours on holidays and weekends, and a limit to the number of simultaneous leaf blowers to 2 on properties of 7,500 square feet or less. Just to note that the 67 decibel noise limit level remains, as is today, as does the 5-acre exemption for non-residential properties and the town exemption from the bylaw. The main thrust of this article are not the smaller changes, however. Slide 4, please. The change in property ownership, in property owner responsibility is, bear in mind that every property owner that hires a landscaper has control over what happens on their property through a written or a verbal agreement. Now faced with a fine for violations, this will provide an incentive for the owner to have a conversation with their landscaper about compliance with the bylaw. It would be wise to have included in their contract, for example, that the landscaper agrees to operate in a lawful manner, with both equipment used and dates and times allowed. The property owner has the ultimate sanction. If their landscaper persists in illegal operations, they will be incentivized to invoke their contract, call their company to task, or even fire them. This is more, we believe, effective than a fine. Slide 5, please. For the first few months, the committee primarily concentrated on getting the opinions of our residents and town departments. We received over 1,300 responses and 3,500 comments to our online survey, and heard from many in person at our public hearings and meetings. Our town departments and other cities were happy to share their experiences and insights. We looked at about 20 other municipalities that have leaf blower regulations and talked with officials in many of them. Meetings with our health department, DPW, and the police department provided crucial information and feedback as we developed our ideas. In Lars Anderson Park, we held an outdoor demonstration test of 7 types of leaf blowers, both gas and electric, to see for ourselves their clearing efficiencies and to hear the noise levels in different settings and combinations. Reviewing our current bylaws and the results of this information gathering, we concluded that our focus should not be on increasing regulations, but improving compliance and enforcing that which we already have with the modifications contained in Article 23. We decided to focus on prevention and deterrence to curtail violations rather than increasing regulations, which are difficult to enforce. Slide, please. Let's take a look at the current bylaw enforcement situation. The complainant calls in, a patrol car is dispatched, priority level 1, by the way, and the officer tries to interdict. How successful is this? Next slide, please. The police log shows, an analysis of the police log shows that on average there are about 120 complaints a year, of which half result in nothing found or the equipment's okay. On average, only about 11 calls per year result in an actual citation, and this year the total is just 2. Our present compliance level and enforcement system is ineffective. Slide, please. A number of other cities and towns use a code enforcement officer to help enforce leaf blower regulations. In the past 5 years, Santa Monica in California has moved the prime responsibility of enforcement from police to civilian code enforcement, and this year Palo Alto has just changed over too. Both cities cited that the move has been beneficial in improving enforcement. One reason is that the leaf blower complaints are managed now by a code enforcement individual who follows up on complaints with both property owner and the developer, and this landscaper. Since much landscaping work is done weekly, they have found that observing a violation the next week after a complaint has been logged increases their enforcement's effectiveness. In Article 24, we are recommending that the Selectmen consider such a position. We've actively worked with Town Administration and the DPW Commissioner to identify an upgrade to an existing code enforcement position. This individual would manage, investigate, educate, and enforce leaf blower noise complaints. This upgraded position is estimated to cost less than $10,000 per year to the town. So here's what it would look like, how it might work. Slide, please. The code enforcer, on receipt of a complaint call, will now open up a case and reach out and communicate with the property owner and the landscape company in writing or by phone or in person, since they are mobile. The DPW has an excellent database of property owner contact information and will have a similar database that we have collected for the active landscape contractors in town. This complaint notification call by the code enforcer to both the property owner and the landscape company is key. Whether or not a violation has occurred, it will inevitably initiate a conversation about the compliance between the property owner and the landscaper concerned. Rather than dealing with an employee just doing their job, the code enforcer now has the leverage with the property owner in the conversation to communicate with both the owners and both owners of the property and of the landscape company. This is another aspect of the there is another aspect of the code enforcer which is preventative. Currently, we average less than 1 complaint call a day. So the code enforcer has time to visit with and educate landscaping crews and residents as to the law and best practices, as well as inspect equipment. Slide, please. It's important to note there is no proposal to remove jurisdiction from the police or replace their authority. The police department is still directly involved in enforcement when a complaint occurs outside business hours, or when a call is made directly to the police, or at the request of the code enforcer themselves. Slide, please. The committee considered the pros and cons of banning gas-powered blowers year-round or more severely curtailing use. We concluded that we already have a restrictive law in place today that bans gas-powered blowers from operation in the summer months. However, as 75% of all complaints occur in these months, it suggests that the bigger problem is that our current compliance level and enforcement process is not working satisfactorily. Many residents have expressed to us that the town does not need additional restrictions, but it does need to effectively enforce the laws that we have. Slide, please. The 2 key proposed provisions contained in Articles 23 and 24 need to work hand in hand. Together they will, when implemented, dramatically reduce violations by providing a systemic solution that focuses on prevention and deterrence. As Benjamin Franklin wisely said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And we believe these articles will indeed prevent violations from occurring, result in less usage, and create a quieter, a greener Brookline. Our goal is to change the behavior of leaf blower users to be more respectful of others and to comply with the bylaw. We believe that this is achievable. Slide, please. Please join the committee in voting favorable action on Articles 23 and 24. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rosenthal, unless you enjoy standing at the microphone, I suggest you sit down because it's going to be about half an hour before we get to questions.
I didn't want to lose my place, but I'd be happy to.
Okay, I'll remember that. Mr. Fisher?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Andrew Fisher, Precinct 13, Town Meeting Member. Articles 23 and 24, Articles 23 and 24 come from a study committee set up in response to a warrant article that proposed a full ban on leaf blowers. That article was in response to the scofflaw attitude of certain landscape companies and to other leaf blower abusers and the lack of effective enforcement. Rather than vote the ban, the issue was referred to a study committee. And I think most of the town meeting understood that the charge of the committee was to come up with recommendations for better enforcement and reduction in leaf blower use. This is not what this committee has done. The committee relied on an online survey, according to the committee chair, who has presented a detailed analysis of the survey results as the basis for these warrant articles. However, the survey is based on an invalid sampling and thus is a flawed survey, and the analysis is only as good as the data it started with. The respondents were self-selecting and not a fair representation of Brookline. According to the committee reports, 50% of the respondents to the survey were landscapers. Another 24% of the residents respondents were residents who use leaf blowers. Thus, 74% of the responses to the survey were leaf blower users. This is not a fair or accurate cross-representation of the population of Brookline, yet this, according to the committee chair, provided the basis for their proposal and not the charge given them from town meeting. What we have began as a complete rewriting of the leaf blower restrictions, much of which has been withdrawn in the vetting process as overreaching or inappropriate. In the rewrite, the leaf blower restrictions were separated from the noise bylaw, and in so doing, a new problem has been created because a sentence was added to the noise bylaw at section 8.15.2 parentheses B4 is added, saying noise regulations concerning leaf blowers are found in Article 8.31, which is the leaf blower bylaw, not the noise ordinance. Does this mean that leaf blowers are no longer governed by the noise bylaw? That's a reasonable reading. Does this mean that if a leaf blower has the right sticker under the leaf blower statute, it is exempt forever from the noise ordinance, even if over time it no longer operates at within the prescribed limits of 67 decibels? Does this mean that a leaf blower can be used in a quiet neighborhood in violation of the noise ordinance because it's regulated under leaf blowers, not the noise ordinance? The reason we have a special leaf blower law is that leaf blowers are a special problem, creating not just noise, but stirring up dust and other particulates into the air and burning fossil fuels needlessly. They are worse than other noise abusers. That's why they need their own bylaw controls. Exempting them from the noise bylaw is the wrong approach. This is one of many flaws in this proposed rewrite. The proposed enforcement procedures continue in the wrong direction.
You have 1 minute.
Now, when a citizen wants to complain about the noise next door, he will have to call a civilian sitting at a desk who can't possibly come to the scene of the crime before the offenders are finished. So he will write a letter to the property owner or manager who will ignore it, saying, "I didn't know anything about it." Can the victim still call the police? It's not clear. Can the police still come? It's not clear. Will they still come? Or will they just leave a voicemail message for the civilian enforcement person who's not at his desk? One thing we do know is that if police come, they are not allowed to issue a citation for a first offense, even if they catch the offender red-handed. How does this enhance enforcement? There is much to be said for the authority of a uniformed police officer with a badge and a weapon to calm a confrontation between an angry citizen complaining about excessive noise and a disobedient landscaper. After the mandatory first warning, which is an invitation to flaunt the law the first time, the fine schedule is changed. The fine schedule now is confusing over who's responsible for the violation and who pays what fine. This unnecessarily complicates what is now easy. The police officer in the nearest patrol car comes to the scene, witnesses the offense or the cell phone videos or the cell phone photos, and in the officer's discretion, he can issue a citation or give a warning. Article 23 does not improve this process. It confuses it, assuring that scofflaw abusers will get away with what they are doing even more easily. With more time, I could articulate...
You're about done, Mr. Fisher?
I am. With more time, I could articulate other problems buried in the rewrite proposed by Article 23, but I expect that this is enough to convince you to vote no action on both Articles 23 and 24. Thank you.
Well, hope springs eternal. Ms. Benka?
Carla Benka, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 13, speaking for the Advisory Committee. Before giving you the Advisory Committee's perspective, I would refer you, in terms of what the charge to the Moderators Committee was, I would refer you to page 1 on the Green Supplement in the Advisory Committee's report under the section entitled Background. So, now on to the Advisory Committee's perspective. Two elements of the proposals generated a significant amount of discussion at the Advisory Committee level. First, liability for regulation violation, and second, the creation of the so-called code enforcement officer. On the one hand, some members believe that the leaf blower user should be solely responsible for his or her actions. How could the property owner possibly know about and therefore be responsible for inappropriate leaf blower use if she or he were at work and couldn't possibly be aware that leaf blowers were being used to clean up grass clippings in the backyard in July? Moreover, holding the property owner accountable could create bad blood with the suspected complainant, particularly if that complainant lived right next door. On the other hand, it was noted that property owners are held liable if their sidewalks aren't shoveled in the winter, and that leaf blower operators shouldn't be punished because most of the time they're just following instructions to get the job done as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And lastly, a property owner would be made aware of a violation via a mandatory written warning before becoming liable for a financial penalty. The committee eventually determined that both parties should be held liable. Although initially voting to impose the maximum fines on each, it reconsidered this position upon learning that such an approach would exceed state-mandated limits on fines, and therefore voted to split the liability 50-50, as is clearly shown on page 10 of the Green Supplement. The other issue that engendered vigorous debate was the creation of Article 24's enforcement position. Questions as to cost and the position's departmental home and responsibilities were raised. Once initial support from the DPW became evident and the cost was estimated not to exceed $10,000, and the article was amended to identify more readily achievable goals for that position, the proposal was endorsed by a near unanimous committee. If the resolution passes, ideally, funds could be found before the end of this fiscal year. Alternatively, funding could be identified via the fiscal 18 budget process. The creation of this position is predicated on the belief that awareness, education, and dialogue are, in the long run, more effective than fines in bringing about compliance. Changes in behaviors and attitudes, the long-term and longer-lasting solution to reducing excessive use and noise, are more likely to take place by working and negotiating with all parties, complainants, property owners, and leaf blower users. In this new dynamic, the police would still be called in when appropriate. Almost all advisory committee members believe that a different approach is warranted to address leaf blower use in the town, one that employs negotiation and works to increase compliance, all the while maintaining enforcement via significant fines as an available stick. More compliance, less noise. It's worth a try. By votes of 2101 and 2110, the advisory committee recommends favorable action on these articles. Thank you.
Ms. Gilman? Three minutes.
Jane Gilman, Precinct 3. Despite citizens' complaints and our 2012 bylaw, leaf blowers still constitute a major irritant to citizens in Brookline. The online leaf blower survey found, quote, many respondents believe the noise from leaf blowers disrupts their quality of life. Well, yes, it does. It penetrates our home, intrudes on face-to-face and phone conversations. It inhibits our enjoyment of music, the radio, and TV. It makes it difficult to conduct business and interferes with children and others' rests. Being outside is even worse, and many of us resent the quiet enjoyment of our own property is impossible. So the question before us is whether the proposed bylaw, I'm calling it one bylaw, protects us, and I submit, despite the appearance, it does not. And here's why I urge you to vote no action on these warrant articles. First, the requirement to allow up to 2 leaf blowers on property of 7,500 square feet or less makes no sense, because the experience of 67 decibels depends upon where you hear them from. We need limits that are context sensitive, not a one-size-fits-all scheme. Some 70% of our population lives in multifamily buildings in dense areas. These hardscapes magnify the noise as it ricochets around the surfaces. Some 7,500 square foot spaces, on the other hand, are in an area with more trees and lawns that soften the noise. The Warren article does not provide for these differences. With respect to the penalties, there are already many documented violations over the years. I'd like to know, will the violators already on record be issued a warning when they commit another violation, or will they be held accountable for past violations? I have concerns about the usefulness of the survey and how it was interpreted. For instance, it found that a majority of respondents were in their home for more than 4 hours a day. But the number of hours they're home isn't the question. The question is, how many hours are they home during the hours that leaf blowers are permitted? Given the incredible disruption to our quality of life, I believe that the job description on page 5 of the supplement does not have enough teeth. Town meeting, or at least I, was led to believe that there would be more compliance coming out of the committee recommendations, and I don't see that happen.
Ms. Gilman.
I urge you to vote no action on both warrant articles 23 and 24.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Mr.
Nancy Daly
Richmond,
for the
come
Board of
forward.
Selectmen. I'm not going to go into the details, which Mr. Doggett gave you, of what the changes are. I will just say that the new bylaw does maintain the 67 decibel upper limit for the noise. Certainly, I think we can all agree leaf blowers are irritating, but we have heard repeatedly from our Parks and Department that they could not do their work without leaf blowers unless the budget was dramatically increased. And so we are exempt from the bylaw. But I think I thought their explanation, Ms. Gallantine's explanation, is very relevant, because she was talking about walkways in our parks or in our public school areas where the leaves gather and get wet and then become very slippery. And I think that's true in front of people's homes and walkways you may have on your property as well. So people apparently feel the need for leaf blowers to get rid of all that stuff. We have heard repeatedly from the Advisory Council on Public Health and the Health Department itself that the threat to public health from leaf blowers is extremely small. So therefore, the Advisory Committee unanimously urges favorable action on...
The selectmen, you mean?
I'm sorry. Yeah, the selectmen urges favorable action on the Advisory Committee's motion on warrant Article 23. On 24, we did have a problem originally when it was calling for us to appoint this civilian leaf blower code enforcement officer, both from the budget point of view of having a dedicated position to this, but also from the point of view of the police department is there all the time, and they have multiple officers who can respond to different locations and things. So we are okay with the rewritten version, which urges us to consider assigning additional duties to the Department of Public Works for enforcement in this area. It's our view that the police department would continue, however, to also be involved in the enforcement because, as I say, one person in DPW is going to have some days off and not be able to respond to multiple locations. And so we think it's important that the police department also be available to go out on those calls. So we will have to work out exactly how that is split, but we are now urging favorable action on the revised warrant Article 24.
Thank you. Mr. Richmond? And Mr. Doty, would you come forward, please?
Clint Richmond, Precinct 6, speaking on behalf of the Green Caucus, which I'm the co-chair. Our endorsement is for no action. We feel that these changes are minimal with respect to noise and sustainability. There are unknown consequences to the separation from the noise bylaw. Overall, we feel this is an adequate response to the increased restrictions on leaf blowers proposed in warrant Article 10 last year. Regarding warrant Article 23, speaking for myself as one of the endorsers, this article has taken the wrong direction from the beginning. It initially proposed to reduce the size exemptions, which increased the number of large properties that would be able to use gas-powered leaf blowers all year long. This was withdrawn after opposition. It proposed fining only homeowners. Landscapers have been restored following opposition. The inclusion of homeowners does not make sense and increases the cost of enforcement since there are now two parties for every violation. There are only 100 contractors under the current law, but we are adding 6,000 1-, 2-, and 3-family homeowners alone. Homeowners are often not home when landscapers are working. Landscapers are the professionals. They should be able to comply without involving the homeowner. It proposed disallowing anonymous complaint calls. This was restored again after opposition. The highlighting of exemptions in the new article to the leaf blower law is the wrong direction. The exemptions in the noise bylaw are for one-off construction projects, not for everyday leaf blowing. This section should not have been carried over. There are no new significant restrictions on gas-powered leaf blowers, or handheld hurricanes, as we sometimes like to call them. This does not in any way encourage quieter or more sustainable alternatives, such as raking or electrics, which are the real solution. Regarding warrant Article 24, changing the enforcement from the police to a town employee is increasing the cost of enforcement, which is a needless waste of our tax dollars, which was an issue that came up when we were talking about the loss of a firefighter. The number of complaints has been small and can be easily handled by the police. I've personally been satisfied with the response of the police when I have called about leaf blowers. I think the potential violators will take the visit from the police more seriously than a town staffer. The police are better able to respond in real-time situations than a town employee with other responsibilities and a limited schedule. Police are more familiar with the town and should be able to get there quicker since they have a wider coverage across town, have dispatch, and can travel fast. They already have a logging system in place. The police are much more efficient and cost-effective. The Green Caucus urges no action on 23 and 24. Thank you.
Mr. Doty here.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dennis Dowdy, Precinct 3, Advisory Committee, and member of the Moderators Committee on Leaf Blowers. I think I should start by saying that it is my personal preference that leaf blowers be operated as infrequently as possible. I'm sensitive to the noise like many people, and particularly sensitive to those sounds. But with that said, I think there's a distinction between my personal preference and what I believe is correct for the town. It was raised, cigarettes are bad, yet we're still allowing them to be sold. Or I appreciate the sentiment here, it doesn't go anywhere near far enough. Plastic generates unnecessary greenhouse gases, but we still have exemptions that allow certain merchants to deliver plastic, to hand out plastic bags. I think arguments of that sort would fall on deaf ears then, and I think they should hear as well. To the extent that this article is too weak, it is precisely because we tried to deliver something that would generate positive improvements without imposing a regulatory burden that would be difficult, if not impossible, to adhere to. To take one example, resetting the warnings each year is simple and easy to understand. Defining all of the rules by which penalties have to follow individuals through property sales, through marriages and divorces is not. And there are other regulations on our books for which penalties similarly reset. Second objection, why do we allow 2 leaf blowers to operate simultaneously, particularly in dense neighborhoods? Under the current rules, any number of blowers are permitted to operate simultaneously, so it could be argued that this represents a significant curtailment from infinity down to 2. But the practical answer is that in our testing, we found that the difference in perceived decibels from the use of 1 to 2 specifically was quite modest and in fact indistinguishable to many of the members of the committee, while the workload, the cleanup load, was increased by somewhere between 1.5 and 2 times, depending upon the configuration. And so in terms of the total perceived annoyance or irritation, it was our belief that this would actually reduce total exposure. I urge favorable action on Articles 23 and 24. Thank you.
Mr. Gordon?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Neil Gordon, Precinct 1 Town Meeting member, a member of the Moderator's Leaf Blower Study Committee, and also a member of the Green Caucus. If Brookline was happy with its current noise and leaf blower bylaws, I assure you I would not be standing here tonight. On the subject of leaf blowers, there is no perfect solution. Warrant Articles 23 and 24, though, are an improvement and a green improvement over the present bylaws. The present noise and leaf blower bylaws define a game of catch me if you can. It's a game that's not so much about compliance, but about less than effective enforcement. There's noise, there's a complaint, the police are called. What do they find and what do they do? Well, half the time they find no violation. The rest of the time, I'll remind you what Mr. Doggett said. In 2016, we're up to 2 citations. It's a game, and perhaps the leaf blowers are winning. Warrant Articles 23 and 24 will change the rules, add an important player, the property owner or manager, and encourage conversation. It's the property owner or manager who controls how a contractor operates. Tell the property owner or manager the rules and explain the consequences. Inevitably, there will be a conversation between the property owner and the contractor. It's that conversation, I believe, that's critical to increase compliance. Increased compliance means a corresponding decrease in leaf blower use and leaf blower noise, leaf blower dust, and leaf blower emissions. I don't often agree with the recommendations, disagree with the recommendations of the Green Caucus. My record may be 100% voting with the Green Caucus. An argument, though, that changes don't go far enough, while fair game, is not on the table here tonight. You're asked to vote only on whether the present or the proposed scheme will better control leaf blower use.
You have 1 minute.
The Moderators Committee, the Board of Selectmen, and the Advisory Committee agree that bringing the homeowner into the equation is an improvement. It's the better, quieter, greener choice. Please vote favorable action on Warrant Articles 23 and 24. Thank you.
Mr. Rosenthal, it's your time.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Marty Rosenthal, Precinct 9 and co-chair PAX. I have, if you permit me, 3 specific questions for Mr. Doggett. And just to put them in context, I have a brief comment that this hall is divided into 3 sections geographically, but I think there are 3 groups in this room. There's a group of town meeting members like myself that considers leaf blowers to be obnoxious, both noise and pollutants and emissions. There's a group that knows that there are people in the community that feel the same way and don't consider that insignificant. And there's a group who know there are people in the community that feel that way and are trying to help them. And those are the people I'm trying to address as to my questions why this is not an adequate bylaw. So the questions are these, if you would. First, well, actually, Mr. Doughty addressed one of them. I just don't buy that 2 is not more than 1, since I always hear 2 next door to me, but put that aside. So the first question will be this. In terms of the once-a-year warning, why should that be different from the snow bylaw where it's not the case, and especially since some people only do their leaves once a year? So an owner could get a warning every year and not be considered a repeat violator.
Mr. Doggett, do you want to field that one?
John Doggett, Chair of the Leaf Blowing Committee. The once-a-year warning. We consider that is important to have for the homeowner in particular as a protection because of the change over here as we move forward and getting the word out and making sure that everybody is up to speed on the new laws. This will take time. The code enforcement officer is a key ingredient there to make that happen, and really we see prevention as being the key goal. And then I talked about the complaint call, which is not a formal warning. A formal warning comes from an observed violation. So that has to be done by the police or the code officer. That can be obviously followed up. But in the initial complaint call that comes in, 50% of them went to waste, as you saw from the statistics. Going forward, if we do, and I hope that we do, with the code enforcement officer, it means that every complaint call is going to be opening up a case and it's going to be investigated. And so, and not only that, the communication between the property owner and the contractor concerned will be identified. I don't believe that we will need a formal warning, except in the most egregious of cases, in which case, and we do know that there are 10 hotspots in town where these 50% of these violations occur, or these complaints occur, I should say. And so therefore, the focus on getting the noise reduced overall is not really dependent on whether there is a warning or not. It's really going to be a function of getting the word out and getting that complaint notification system in effect, because that will have that, it will initiate that conversation between the property owner and the landscaper, which will, I will predict, very quickly solve that problem. So
let's get to Mr. Rosenthal's next question.
Well, I won't press that further, although I'm not sure that the warning question got answered. But my second question is, I'm mystified by the report's repeated discussion about that there's no compelling public health threat, and wonder, I'm not going to ask you to define compelling, we all have our own understanding of that, but the question is, last year for PAX we called to the attention of this town meeting, and I think I did when I appeared at your hearing, a September 6, 2013 Washington Post Health and Sciences article entitled, How Bad for the Environment Are Gas-Powered Leaf Blowers, and discussing the pollutants and that they escape in large quantities. So my question is, do you recall whether the committee ever looked at that article that was called to your attention, and whether you dismiss it as being, quote, not compelling?
John Doggett again. I'm not sure of the article, the exact article, Marty, I'm sorry, but we did talk with Dr. Balsam and Dr. Anthony Scharf of the Advisory Committee for Public Health. We had a whole meeting devoted to that, and where they discussed the health impact, and basically reiterated their report from, I think it was October of last year when they did it for Article 10, and their minds have not changed since, that they found no documented evidence of any health impact directly associated with leaf blowers, was their conclusion.
I think you left out the word compelling, but thank you very much, Mr.
Well, to me, their opinion was compelling.
Compelling is what I'm talking, is the word I'm questioning. So,
all
right, I'm urging no action, and thank you very much, both of you.
Ms. Frawley?
Yes, Regina Frawley from 16. I live in an area where over 30% of the single-family small lots are senior citizens. They have health issues. They tell me about that in our socials. They can't always comply, and some of them are beginning to talk about getting leaf blowers. That's number one. I don't want to penalize them. Number two, any business person will tell you that if you can talk about a 50-50 split to the homeowner, and I think that's unfair to begin with, but the business person's going to pass it on to the homeowner. Ultimately, 100% will be paid by the homeowner. And so those are two of the important points. And the third is, I'm very disturbed about a discussion about leaf blowers where enforcement is praised for a badge and a gun, and I think that's very inappropriate. I'm very disturbed by that. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Pelkey?
Linda Olson, Pelkey, Precinct 2. I'm very concerned about the imposition of a fine to the property owners. And one thing I would point out is that this comparison to the snow requirement is very straightforward. You've either cleared your walk or you haven't. We've managed to tie ourselves in knots with such a complex way of trying to have our leaf blowers but still controlling them that it's reached the point of ridiculous. I don't like leaf blowers. I hate them. They come to my property and I run and shut my windows because they blow black dust all in my house. But they're kind of a reality, and if we're not willing to ban them, and maybe I'd support a ban, but if we're not willing to ban them, then all of this gyrations just seems like a waste of our staff time. We're going to hire a new person, all this enforcement effort, and honestly, I still can't remember what the dates are after all this time. So, I am a trustee at a large condominium, and I will tell you that if this gets passed, I'm going to worry. Now it becomes my job. It shouldn't be my job. Does that guy have a sticker on his leaf blower? Is he here the time he's supposed to be here? Oh, how many are there? How many square feet is my lawn? And then if they get a threat, a violation, a warning letter to my property manager, this is a woman who I can't get on the phone, and I'm a trustee because of the workload she's already under. And we're dealing with serious issues like leaks and no heat and things like that. And we want her to pick up the phone and immediately talk to the landscape contractor whose employees can't speak English. I am opposed to these. I'm sorry.
Mr. Gordon?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Neil Gordon, Precinct 1. Might I ask Town Council to opine on the provisions of the noise bylaw that may or may not be lost with the approval of warrant Article 23?
Jocelyn Murphy, Town Council. I did review this question, and I was unable to find any substantive losses.
Thank you, Ms. Gilman.
Question, Mr. Moderator.
Who are you?
I'm Jane Gilman, Precinct 3. I'm a
thought
little
so.
confused on the testing that Mr. Dowdy spoke of when he said there was no measurable or discernible difference between one device and two. And I'd like to know where that testing was taking place.
Well, there's a simple answer to that. Mr. Doggett, do you know?
John Doggett. The testing was done at Lars Anderson Park at 50 feet. We were separated from 50 feet from the blowers, and we turned our backs, and we asked specifically for the staff to do 2 blowers moving leaves and to cut off 1 blower whenever they felt likely. And basically 2 to 3 decibels is hard for the human ear to detect, and most of the committee members could not detect the difference between 1 and 2 blowers going. And the science for this is that 265, they're using 65 decibel machines. 265 decibel machines, when run together, if you go to the science books and do the sound math and all that kind of stuff, which is documented in our report, it only adds 2 dB, 2 to 3 dB maximum. So therefore, 265 blowers at 50 feet, same distance, sounds like 67 dB, which is effectively our limit. And so it was a practical experience that's what we discovered. And as I think Mr. Doherty pointed out, that the efficiency of having 2 meant that it's faster. It clears 50 to 100% times faster, which means that overall the noise takes less time and doesn't really make any difference in terms of the volume, the sound level to you. So therefore, we felt that on balance, that was the way to go.
Thank you. With all due respect, Mr. Doggett, I think you're aware that very few people live in Lars Anderson Park, and that 70% of us live in hardscape surfaces in more urban areas.
John Doggett again.
Yeah, I don't think you have to respond to that, Mr. Doggett. Ms. Michaels?
Hello, town meeting members. I'm Faith Michaels from Precinct 5, and I came before you all last year to respond to warrant Article 10 that suggested that we ban all gas-powered leaf blowers. Since then, I decided to become more involved in town process and became a town meeting member and served on the Moderators Committee on Leaf Blowers. You sent us to the table to investigate and research the issue. I was dubious at first and felt that many of the appointees already had a strong position on the subject. We met almost 20 times and researched every aspect. We learned a lot about leaf blowers, noise. We listened to the public, the town, health experts, manufacturers, and very importantly, we listened to each other. And this is how we came to present you with the package tonight. We believe it'll work. Why? Because some aspects of the program are already working. What are they? 1, I've been able to compile a list of over 250 landscape providers working in Brookline. There are probably at least 50 more. 2, every landscape provider on the list received a letter this season from the Brookline Police stating the town's regulations and best practices. 3, every landscape company on that list has received this pamphlet. I left mine at home on the printer, but that I published and wrote in 3 different languages, and it outlines the regulations and also best practices. In fact, I drive around town in my truck, and I'll often stop and hand it out, but it's been sent by email to my entire landscape list also. When a complaint is received, this is number 4, I consult my list, call the owner of the company directly. This has been extremely effective in having companies comply. When that does not work, we have brought in our trusty leaf blower liaison from the police department to make the call, and that usually does the trick. 5, the landscape community did not want another season to go by without working on its own changes. We are improving with education and communication, and it's working. Complaints are down in the town. 6, our leaf blower demo day taught us a lot. The steel company came in and showed us what was down the pike and what they have available today. The Public Works Department was impressed with a particular quieter and cleaner model. The EPA standard is 75 or less grams of hydrocarbon emissions per kilowatt hour.
You have 30 seconds.
The newest machine runs at around 18 grams. I'm happy to report that the Public Works Department bought some of these machines to replace the old ones. Public Works has also shared the best practice pamphlet with their crews and is only using the heavier machines when absolutely necessary. So we're all working together. 7, at a public meeting, last year's Article 10 petitioner mentioned it had been quieter in his neighborhood and the company who had been flouting the law had come into compliance. What he didn't know is that I had extensive conversations with that company to get them to toe the line. I tell you this is an example of how this can and will work if you vote it forward. I thankfully will be doing less of that work, more on my own, and the compliance officer will take over. Do we need to go back to the drawing board, meet more times, make more rules? Many of you agreed last year that education and behavioral changes are preferable to regulation. I hope you give us a chance to put every aspect of this program in place to have a successful outcome. As I said last year, wouldn't it be nice if this were an issue that didn't return to town meeting every fall along with the leaves? Thank you.
Okay, I have, the question's been called. Is there a second? I have Ms. Hollowell on the speaker's list to speak in favor of the motion before you, and I have Mr. Swartz and Mr. Richmond and the gentleman on my right.
Mr. Nangle.
Against that background, it takes a 2/3 vote to terminate debate, and we'll cut off these gentlemen. Those in favor of ending debate, please raise your hands. Those opposed, motion carries by a 2/3 vote. Mr. Carroll, where are you? All right, I assume there'll be 35 people who want to. So this is Article 23, main motion. Okay, you can proceed to vote. Motion carries by a vote of 114 in favor, 68 against, and 3 abstentions. On the motion under Article... Yes, sir? I beg your pardon? Oh, no. We have another article before us. And that's Article 24, the motion on page 4 of the purple supplement. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Do you want a recorded vote? All right, do 35 town meeting members want a recorded vote? I don't... well, if we wait long enough, we'll get 35, so... this is Article 24, main motion. Okay, you can proceed to vote. Motion carries by a vote of 115 in favor, 65 against, and 5 abstentions. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we probably had enough for tonight. And I'll entertain a motion to adjourn, even though it's not quite 10:30. Is there a second? All in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. This meeting is adjourned to tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. Please remember to turn in your handheld devices. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.